told you. Didn't I tell you I'm praying?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us once again. This is the Castle Think Tank, once again with another webinar. And today we shall be discussing the public-private partnerships issue on the think tank. But before we proceed into the discussion today, I'm going to request Mrs. Angelina Tunomjuni to open up this discussion and this engagement with a word of prayer. Angelina.
Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come to you this morning. We thank you that your mercies are new every morning and great is your faithfulness. This morning we look to you for your mercies which are new. We look to you for wisdom and direction. We look to you for your presence. We ask that your hand will be upon each of our panelists, upon the moderator and upon the public as we deliberate on this important subject of public-private partnerships. We ask that the internet will hold. We ask that we shall have inroads and make recommendations that can be used to improve this sector to the glory and honor of your name. We welcome you and we thank you for the opportunity that you give us to partner with you in bringing transformation in this nation through this Thrive webinar series. In the name of Jesus, we have prayed and believed. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Angelina, for kicking us off with that word of prayer. Just a couple of things that I need us to remind ourselves about as we get into this webinar. Every about 30 minutes, we'll be popping up a poll question, and that is a way in which you can participate. When you see the poll question come, kindly participate and respond to the poll, because all the polls have something in relation to the discussion at hand today. So when you see the poll coming up, we will be requesting that you respond, as always, to the poll. We have hashtags for this webinar today. And so if you're on Twitter, it is #CastleWebinar, #CastleWebinar, and #ThrivePPP. So if you see those hashtags, kindly retweet, invite other people into the discussion, comment, because we need the discussion to extend beyond this Zoom call. And the discussion as well is being broadcast live on the Facebook page. If you look for the page of Castle Think Tank, you will find this video running in the live environment. So you can share, you can invite, you can host a watch party so we can have a wider viewership. And for people who may not be able to join us on the Zoom call, we still need them to join us in the discussion in that way. And then, as well as part of our practice, we do have a Q&A chat room. If you look on your screen where the menus are sitting, you will see something with the inscription Q&A. So when you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have a contribution, we welcome those contributions. You simply click there, make that contribution, and then the panelists will be responding as appropriate to those questions, to the comments, and well, when we get to the general discussion, which we'll have later on in this webinar, we will be able to pick up a couple of those questions and comments and have a discussion over them. So welcome once again to this discussion on public-private partnerships. PPP approach to development finance has been employed in a number of areas, and it has been deployed in Europe, Asia, Africa to finance projects ranging from general projects, transport-related, power-related, and water-related majorly. Traditional sources of infrastructure finance have been constrained ever since the world hit the financial crisis in 2008. But the last 10 years have seen a rise in PPPs in developing economies as a means of crowding investment and expertise from the private sector. But PPPs are generally considered to be more expensive than purely public financing due to the higher private sector borrowing costs in many cases and high transaction costs that sometimes become apparent in general. But some countries that are more successful in attracting finance from the private sector have established prioritized programs of investment and opportunities. And therefore, developing successful PPPs programs is a complex undertaking. And it involves a number of key challenges for developing countries. Some of them are legal, others are regulatory, and they call for an adequate protection and ensuring that obligations of all parties involved in this PPP arrangement, whether it's government or investors or lenders alike, are still held to their side of the bargain. So clearly, the PPPs are filling in a much needed role in infrastructure development projects, but they require very strong governance structures to benefit the taxpayers of the respective countries where they are practiced and where the calls for deployment of the best hands and heads to be implemented are required. So today we are here to explore the role that PPP will play or that is playing in the development of Uganda. And we shall have, in no order of preference or importance on this webinar today, we are privileged to have the following panelists and discussants. We have Dr. Kenneth Semogere, Michael Opaji, Mr. Jim Mugunga, and all their profiles shall be fully introduced to you as we call them up one by one to enter into the discussion. I will be moderating the discussion today, and my name is Bukenya Paul Michael. But before we get into that discussion, allow me to invite the Castle Think Tank chairperson of the board, Dr. James Magara, to make some opening remarks. Dr. Magara.
Thank you very much, Paul, and very, very warm welcome to all our panelists and our participants this morning. We really appreciate you making time to be with us this morning. We have a very, very distinguished panel, and we are extra grateful that they could actually make time to be with us and share with us from their source of knowledge and expertise, and also to all who are attending. It's a bit of a niche discussion, so I hope we'll have more time, as you say, to go into detail. It's not one of those topics that will attract the general public. But I do hope, as we've always done with these webinars, that what comes out of here will inform decisions, will inform policy, and also create linkages as we move forward in implementing PPPs. PPPs. We're talking about PPPs. Now, Castle, as a think tank, this year decided to focus on looking for opportunities in the mess that was what has been the pandemic. And as we've gone through this series, those who've been regulars would appreciate that there are a lot of opportunities in the midst of the chaos that has engulfed the whole world. And we do hope that today will be a very similar sort of experience as we look at opportunities that will emerge. Now, the reason we set these things, these forums for engagement up was initially we had our own meeting as a think tank and came up with brainstorming ideas. Because of our large membership, we had a multi-sectoral meeting. The ideas were refined, and now we are presenting them to public to get, and also to experts and the public, to get more input into them. It's not an end process. After this, we'll be moving them on to policy briefs and documents, and that's a process which is ongoing now. The whole team working on that. So we do hope that this morning we'll be able to facilitate a discussion on public-private partnerships, especially in view of exploring the opportunities that have been presented by the pandemic, And we'll also it's a time for education as well. So while we are talking with the experts, would ask that they simplify the language so that others who are not so much on board will be able to understand what is going on. So we'll have an opportunity to review the current responses as well. And it's a time for engagement. And we do hope that out of this will be recommendations. There will be recommendations and ideas that can move this sector forward. CASO exists to serve, to be a catalyst, to help with what government and the private sector are doing. So what we expect out of this morning is a greater input into the marketplace of ideas that those who make decisions and those who make policies can draw from. Wish you all a very, very successful and useful interaction this morning. Thank you very much. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magara. And to kick us off in the discussion this morning is the discussant from CASO Think Tank, Mr. Bernard Owundo, who is a partner, Citadel Advocates Legal and Consultancy Firms. Bernard is a legal consultant as well as a practicing lawyer, and the firm that he leads specializes in legal advisory services. Bernard went into private practice, having spent close to 9 years working as legal advisor of the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. First as legal counsel with the privatization unit, and thereafter as expert at the PPP unit. He has played a lead advisory role on a number of government privatization and PPP projects, including evaluation of project proposals, structuring of project finance, negotiation of concession agreements, as well as reviewing financial, legal, and technical due diligence reports and feasibility studies. He has been the legal advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development concerning the financing options for the implementation of cross-border projects involving Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, which include the standard gauge railway line, crude oil pipeline, transmission lines, and oil refinery spanning 4 countries, Uganda, Kenya, South Sudan, and Rwanda, under the Northern Corridor Initiative. He has served as board member for the Uganda Railways Corporation. He has also served as legal consultant for infrastructure, PPPs, and guarantees, World Bank Group. And he is a certified public-private partnership specialist, holds a Master's of Laws distinction in Petroleum Law and Policy from the University of Dundee, Master of Laws from Makerere University, Bachelor of Laws with honors, first class from the Uganda Christian University, and a postgrad diploma in legal practice from the Law Development Center, Uganda. Bernard, kindly take it away and present the paper.
Thank you very much for this discussion on PPPs. I am also happy to see Mike all the way from South Africa. And I also would like to thank the CASO leadership for giving us the opportunity to be able to discuss PPPs in Uganda, especially as regards to the implications of COVID-19 and the thought process on what we think as CASO the government should be focusing on. I'll briefly go through the PowerPoint presentation, and I'll start with just the introduction. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to cross-sectoral disruptions across the world, with virtually all countries having to adjust their fiscal priorities and resource mobilization options in order to address the pandemic's impact on health systems, economies, livelihoods, and social security systems, among others. Uganda, of course, there has been no exception. And we actually sought emergency support from the International Monetary Fund's COVID-19 Financial Assistance and Debt Service Relief Facility in order to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. We received about $491.5 million. With the IMF projecting negative global economic growth in 2020, it is evident that the traditional sources of inflows for many countries are bound to remain depressed for a while. in tandem to the pace of mass availability of vaccine to decisively stem the advance of COVID-19. As you realize also, most of the development institutions are now looking towards COVID relief fund packages. And so that means that public-private partnerships will become even more relevant as an arrangement for sustaining the provision of public services and public infrastructure, given the heightened constraints to public finances and private capital. Of course, the fundamental benefit of PPP lies in the cost and process efficiencies gained by optimizing private sector technologies, agility, funding, and expertise with public sector contribution. This, of course, helps countries to accomplish major infrastructure and public services on mutually beneficial terms, including risk sharing and private sector profit. As by way of background, public-private partnerships in Uganda are governed by the PPP Act 2015. This act took long. It took about maybe 2 years or 3 years to get passed. We now have PPP regulations, and we also have PPP guidelines. The basis for the PPP Act was the PPP policy, and that then laid the basis for the PPP Act 2015. Before that, we had the Public Enterprise Reform and Divestiture Act, and as a matter of fact, most of the transactions that were done under the Public Enterprise and Reform Divestiture Act are those that have been called PPPs, including the Umeme concession, the Rift Valley Railway concession, the Nile Hotel concession. All these were done under the Public Enterprise Reform and Divestiture Act. So when we look at PPPs, we start that discussion from that place. In terms of progress of PPPs in Uganda, I would make a few points. Number one, I think we have an established governance framework for PPPs in conformity with international best practice. The PPP unit has been established. The PPP committee has also been established under the provisions of the PPP Act. So we have made tremendous progress in terms of the legal and institutional framework for PPPs. Number two, we have, of course, registered notable progress to date. According to the World Bank, I think between 1990 and 2019, the country closed about 29 PPPs valued at about US dollars 2 billion, most of which were in the energy sector. There are currently 24 PPPs in the active or developing stage, valued at about 1.5 billion. This figure should have changed since we now have Compilation Expressway, which is estimated at about $1.2 billion. In terms of transparency and disclosure, we have to thank the development partners, thank the World Bank, which helped us come up with a transparency and disclosure diagnostic report, which actually provides for transparency and the sort of information that should be shared with the public. It remains to be seen whether that is being implemented. And I think that should be one of the focuses of our discussion. Public-private partnerships, of course, have been an integral part of Uganda's National Development Plan 3, and they feature clearly as the framework to achieve the government's intent to proactively escalate its participation in strategic sectors under PPP arrangements with the private sector. Overall, the energy sector has been one in which PPP has been most successful. In the transport sector, of course, we've had the Rift Valley Railways project, but that was terminated. That notwithstanding, we have the Compilation Expressway, which is in the procurement phase. Uganda has now moved to diversify the scope of its PPP engagement beyond energy and transport to include sports. So we have the National Council for Sports Redevelopment of Sporting Complex. We have redevelopment of Uganda Post Limited Properties. We have Kampala Solid Waste Management. We also have the Gulu Logistics Hub. So we have now a number of projects which are being considered for PPPs. Let's now move to the challenges. The challenges to PPPs in Uganda. Of course, as part of the World Bank team that did the country diagnostic report for PPPs in Uganda and the Uganda Economic Update, that was the point in about 2017, there were weaknesses in the PPP regulatory framework, That hasn't yet been resolved in terms of the harmony with other laws. For example, I'll take the example of the electricity sector. The Electricity Act also provides for procurement of private sector, and yet you also have the PPP Act, which provides for the procurement of a private sector partner. So there have always been ongoing discussions in terms of what law should apply if you're going to consider PPPs to procure a private sector partner in the electric sector. These questions have arisen, especially after the passing of the PPP Act. It will also be very important to also look at the oil sector, the oil and gas sector, to look at the midstream legislation, the petroleum legislation, basically in the oil and gas sector, and how PPPs can be used to facilitate investments in that sector. So there's need to harmonize the legislation around the oil and gas sector and the PPP Act. One of the other challenges, of course, is skills deficit, capacity building. That's not a new problem. It's a problem that is faced globally. Having skilled people to prepare these projects is something that is very challenging. And that has always been a challenge. And the good thing with building capacity is that you have to building capacity is a process. So it will take time for us to say that we've reached that point where we actually have sufficient expertise and capacity. Of course, the issues to do with how you retain that capacity when you get it, given the fact that there is a global deficit of people with PPP skills globally. There have also been issues around cost of executing PPPs. One of the things that the PPP Act did was to create what we call the Project Development Facilitation Fund. This Project Development Facilitation Fund was supposed to assist in dealing with the transaction costs for advising on PPPs. Globally, I think the transaction cost is between 7 to 10%. So if you have a $200 million project, you may spend anything between $15 to $20 million to prepare such a project. So you can see that for us to have well-prepared projects, the Project Development Facilitation Fund, which was created under the PPP Act, is very vital. The other challenge is really around the constraints long-term financing in Uganda. Our capital market is not deep enough. If you look at our commercial banks, they can only lend for a period of 7 years. They do not invest in long-term projects. So how you deal with that is one of the key issues that Uganda is facing. Of course, we all of us look to the National Social Security Fund, but it's also limited in the range of domestic instruments it can resort to for beneficial long-term investments. So we will really need to have a discussion on access to long-term financing in Uganda if we're going to have a good PPP journey. There are also issues around management and implementation of PPPs. As you know, PPPs are long-term contracts. They are usually contracts between 20, 25 years, and in some instances 30 years. Therefore, for you to effectively manage, you need to have contract management expertise. That is very vital for PPPs. And as we are developing capacity for preparing these projects, we also need to be focusing on ensuring that when these projects are prepared and these projects are finally executed, do we have the people to manage the contract? Otherwise, if you don't have the people to manage the contract, you could fall in a situation, for instance, that Umeme had when Parliament wanted to terminate its concession, largely arising out of one, management of public expectations, but also dealing with the issue of how the contract was actually being monitored and managed. The last point on really the challenges is the limitations associated with private partners. Of course, one of the key issues under this is our private sector. Do we really think that our private sector can participate in these transactions? I'll give a very quick example of Compilation Expressway, $1.2 billion project. So even if you decide to have the private sector, our private sector in Uganda participate, do they have the funds to be able to participate? They may not participate as equity shareholders in the special purpose vehicle, but can they even participate in terms of just providing the supply? Do they have the funds? It's a similar question in the oil and gas sector when we talk about local content. One of the things is really having a local content fund to try and help our private sector participate in most of these transactions. I'll now move to the impact of COVID on PPPs in Uganda. Uganda is one of the countries that implemented several measures in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. These measures were implemented under the Public Health Act and the regulations, some of which have since been lifted at different levels, including a ban on entry into the country. First from COVID-19 category 1 classified countries, and later from all foreign borders. Restrictions on movement within the country through the ban on public transport have also been lifted. In our view, as CASO, the impact of COVID-19 will depend on the length of the disruption and will be felt differently by each PPP project depending on its specific conditions. I have seen literature on the internet. We think that you can't generalize the implications of COVID-19, and therefore I have taken two case studies, one on Umeme and the other on Compilation Expressway. I think the Compilation Expressway is the first project that is being implemented under the PPP Act since it was passed in 2015. Umeme was implemented under the Public Enterprise Reform and Divestiture Act. It's still a PPP. So if we focus on the two examples, just to look at the implications of COVID-19, and we look at Umeme's experience with COVID-19, I have had I've had a opportunity to look at the interim condensed financial statements for the period ended 30th June, where Umeme reported its operation and financial performance during the second quarter of the year, which is April to June, that was negatively impacted by the effects of COVID-19. This report has some insights, and we've noted the following impacts as CASO. Number one, there has been a reduction in power demand, cut downs on the operations of factories and small and medium enterprises led to a plummeting in power consumption. This, of course, meant a reduction in revenue by an estimated Uganda shillings 13 billion. However, with the easing of the lockdown, the consumption levels have started to rise again. The other is low levels of revenue collection. Umeme has also reported low revenue collections due to, among others, a directive from government for the distributor not to disconnect customers, especially essential services such as health, water, and defense for unpaid bills. The report, however, acknowledges that with the easing of the lockdown, revenue collection is starting to rise again. There's also been stagnation of operations due to the ban on returnees from foreign countries. According to Umeme, when the government put a ban on the return of individuals who are still in foreign countries, some of those who were affected were Umeme's critical staff. For example, those working on the CT2 hydropower plant evacuation line. Resultantly, there was a delay in completion of the project, which was 96% complete. There's also been delayed connection of newer clients due to government's shifting of priorities in view of COVID-19. In keeping with the electricity connections policy, the government of Uganda is supposed to finance new electricity connections in the country. However, because of the unexpected development of the COVID-19 pandemic, the funds allocated have run out, yet prospects of adding more funds are low in view of pressing COVID-19 related priorities. There have also been electricity losses due to reduced field operations. During the enforcement of the lockdown, Umeme reportedly was unable to conduct its field activities, including those relating to combating energy losses. Consequently, it incurred an energy loss to a tune of Uganda shillings 27 billion. This is a substantial loss that could actually affect future service delivery. There's also been increased cost of operations due to SOPs. It is further noted that COVID-19 has increased the cost of operations by the facility, including purchase of PPPs, sanitizers, fumigation, as well as increased cost of transportation of field teams with restrictions on occupancy in a single vehicle. The point we make about Umeme really is the fact that you've had a delay in some of the projects being implemented, you've had electricity losses, you've had low revenue collections. And the most significant point around this is that this could have an impact on the concession agreement. Under the concession agreement, they had collection targets. Under the concession agreement, they had a defined loss target. So the question would be, how has this impact, has it been severe to warrant an amendment or of the concession agreements to deal with the impact of COVID-19? I think that's a discussion that maybe the government is having, but also a legal discussion that is happening on several other contracts. Whether COVID-19 is a material adverse effect or is a force majeure event are things that are being discussed in legal circles. So that could have an impact on Umeme's operations. The next example I want to give is Kampala-Jinja Expressway. So we looked specifically at two examples, Umeme being an existing concession, and then Kampala-Jinja Expressway being a project that is in the pipeline. The Kampala-Jinja Expressway project is supposed to be a 30-year greenfield design, build, finance, operate, and maintain arrangement for about 77 kilometers of main line from Kampala to Jinja. And 18 kilometers bypass to the south of Kampala city with an estimated cost of about $1.5 billion. The road was necessitated by the desire to relieve congestion on the existing Kampala-Jinja highway. And according to UNRWA, KJE is just one of the 5 expressway projects identified in the Vision 2040 and the National Development Plan 2. So this project is critical, and it's the first PPP project to be implemented under the PPP Act 2015. By the time COVID came in, they had started the procurement phase, and they had completed the expressions of interest and pre-qualified about 6 consortia that are supposed to participate in this in the request for proposal stage. Now I am informed that they cannot continue. COVID has therefore had an impact, and we need to start to think about these questions. If the current situation remains, and by all estimates, we are seeing estimates of about 2 years, will the procurement process be restarted after 2 years? Will the current pre-qualified bidders be in a position to bid for this same project after 2 years? In view of the disruption to supply chains and increased cost of materials for the projects, does the current project estimate require fresh analysis? What will be the effect of these cost implications of the transaction structure of Kampala-Jinja Expressway? For instance, the envisaged financing options. It's also supposed to be financed from development finance. I think the Africa Development Bank, the EU, all these are contributing some sort of financing to the Kampala-Jinja Expressway. The issue is, with most of these development finance institutions now turning to COVID fund relief packages, will they still be in a position to provide that sort of financing to KJE?
Mr. Wanyama, sorry, Mr. Wunda, we have 3 minutes to go.
Okay, let me try and go through this. So in terms of the Kampala-Jinja Expressway, we see that there is COVID will have a likely impact on the transaction structure of this project and will have far-reaching consequences. That will not be a good story for PPPs in Uganda, considering that it is our first PPP project in Uganda. And we thought that doing it and completing it would provide some sort of basis for us to be able to continue. Our concluding observations, opportunities, and recommendations. I think COVID-19 pandemic provides us an opportunity for capacity building. While things are the way they are, can we take advantage and do capacity building online? The costs are less. You don't have to pay for hotel and accommodation and flight and flight fares. So can we take this opportunity and focus on that? Can we also start focusing at other opportunities, especially in the schools that have been closed down? And can we also take an opportunity to focus on the capacity of our local service providers to fill the gaps created by the travel ban? The recommendations, I've looked at recommendations in about 5 ways, and I'll try and summarize them as quick as I can. 1, We think that government needs to prioritize the PP projects. We need to look at our PPP pipeline and prioritize projects that will quickly generate local employment and economic growth. As we do this, we must consider whether these projects will be fit for purpose in the new reality. We've also looked at the legal and regulatory environment, and we just took an example of the Procuring Infrastructure PPP 2018 report, which addresses the regulatory framework of about 135 countries. Where is Uganda in terms of preparation of PPPs, procurement of PPPs, unsolicited proposals, and contract management? You can see the scores: Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, and we also looked at the United Kingdom to just see the scores in terms of preparation of PPPs, procurement of PPPs, PP contract management. We need to focus on the gaps that have been raised by this report. Some of them deal with the lack of a specific methodology, for example, for economic analysis assessment, fiscal affordability assessment, risk identification, and absence of standardized PPP contracts. So can we use this opportunity to address the challenges and the gaps that have been cited in that report? We've also looked at use of unsolicited bids. I think the World Economic Forum has argued more recently for the increased use of USPs as a tool. In the situation that we are, would require more private sector innovation. Now, the only way to have private sector innovation in PPPs is to have the use of unsolicited bids. We've also looked at structural constraints to financing. We need to see what we can do about NSSF. I've already mentioned building up the institutional capacity, and we also need to develop a robust public communications strategy. In conclusion, the COVID-19 crisis has exposed gaps in our framework and stressed the need for more resilient PP and contractual frameworks going forward. That said, we can thrive and take advantage of COVID-19. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Mr. Oundo, for indeed an enlightening discussion. Now, like we said, we'll be having a poll question every now and then. We are going to be having our first poll question today. And as we wait for that poll question, please, the hashtags for today's webinar is #CastleWebinar and #ThrivePPP. Let's get people onboarded on Twitter. We are also broadcasting live on Facebook. For the panelists, there is questions starting flowing on the Q&A section. For the people attending the webinar, you can make your views known on the Q&A section of this webinar. The panelists will be waiting to respond to your questions and comments. Let's have the poll question, the first poll question, come up as we wait to get into the first response. All right, we'll move on as we wait. I guess there is a bit of challenge with the poll questions. We'll move on to the first discussant, Dr. Kenneth Semogerere. Dr. Kenneth Semogerere is a lecturer in public-private partnerships at Makerere University. Dr. Kenneth Semogerere is a Ugandan architect and a lecturer in PPP at Makerere University since 2004. He is a past president, 2011 to 2013, of the Uganda Society of Architects, an associate member, Singapore Institute of Architects, international member, Malaysia Institute of Architects, and Architectural Association of Kenya. He teaches construction management and professional practice, urban infrastructure development, and financing. He is the founder of SASA Infrastructure Group Limited, and he pioneered a postgraduate certificate course in PPPs at Makerere University, which started in 2018. He is an advisor on real estate investments to the National Social Security Fund Board of Directors. He is a born-again man who got to know the Lord in 1991. He is married, and he is a person that takes on existing challenges head-on, and he thinks through solutions that are tailor-made for our nation. Kenneth graduated from Makerere University as the best final year architecture student in 1999 and received a scholarship to do a master's in engineering and technology in Russia in 2001, where he proceeded to do his doctorate in construction management. and he completed that by the age of 34 in 2009. He is a certified PPP specialist, which course he did at the World Bank IP3 Center in Washington, D.C., 2015. Dr. Kenneth, we welcome you to respond to the presentation at hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, and the rest of the crew. We appreciate you so much for putting this together. It is our desire that we keep on promoting this whole idea of PPPs. I'll just highlight a couple of things, taking it from where Bernard ended. And the two things I'll highlight is the issue of skills deficiency. You can imagine that before I went to study PPPs, I did not know actually what it meant. And I've kept on hearing people say that every form of relationship between a private party and a public party is a PPP. But ideally, if you read the Act, and thank God we now have the law in place, and if you read the Act, it discusses it as a commercial transaction. In other words, there is money exchanging hands. In other words, one party expects something from the other. And one of the things that we need to keep a tag on is that in everything that we enter as a PPP, we need to ascertain the revenue stream. We need to ascertain that where is the money coming from. The money from the private sector has never been free. It will never be free. Anybody coming and saying, I'm giving you money to do a project, believe me, they are having to look at a profit thereafter. They are taking a risk. And if you do it here in Africa, it's actually very, very risky. So that means that if you're going to go into PPPs, we need to be clear that the private party comes on the table with some idea, with a desire that they are going to get a profit. So when you hear Parliament complaining over Umeme and the money they're making, and at that time when I went to cancel the contract, it needs to come out clearly that the private party doesn't come here to give some free service. Okay. So that makes it actually very complicated. So when people talk about things like supply of water to Karamoja people, it's a PPP, we shall use a PPP to help remove the slums in Kampala. It has to come out very clearly that at the end of the day, when the project is done, the revenue stream thereafter must be clear. What do we mean? That on a toll road, people get onto the road and they'll pay. In a hospital, people come and they'll pay. In a school, there must be a clarity on where is the money going to come back from. So I need to put that across very clearly, that in a PPP, you should never assume that things are going to be free. Okay, so that brings me to the second point, the issue of skills deficiency. When I did the course, into clearly that these things are complicated. Okay, just as Owunda has mentioned, it takes a high cost because of the specialists involved. You have the legal, you have the technical, you have the commercial guys. And for everyone that is coming on the table, they will require that they'll do their best to get the best of the services. They'll get the high quality accountants, high quality architects, engineers, so that when the project comes on the table, their interests are safeguarded. So this is where I want to point clearly most of those who are listening in. It is very clear that because we run deficient budgets, because we can't, the taxes that are coming from the people are like at max. URA cannot do any more magic to bring in more money. So it is becoming very clear that unless we tap into the private funding, and there is private funding, even if it's going to be affected by COVID, that doesn't change the fact that the public money is increasing. Of course, the public coffers are also suffering. So that means that when everything comes to show, and we're going to discuss how then do we proceed beyond COVID, somebody must answer that question. The government doesn't have enough money because the taxes have gone down. And that's for sure. You cannot get taxes. Many companies will be filing either nil or negative this year. So that means that the national coffers are going to be so constrained. While that is happening, remember on the other side of services, the demand for public services is increasing. The hospitals are being constrained, the offices are being needed. The dynamics are changing big time. That the public funds are going down, the private funds also are going down. However, the requirement, the role of government to provide services for the public does not change. So what does that mean? That means that people have to think outside the box. I am aware that the PS for finance is very keen for any MDA that is going to do a project, and they go to finance and they expect government to finance the project. Most likely they will say no, outside the box. This is where I'm calling upon young people who want to go into masters or PhDs. This is one area you need to specialize in. And this is the reason. You recall that because some of the funding will come from abroad, that means that when they come from abroad, their money has to come with some tags. It has to come with some conditions. And we should have on the other side of government, people who are willing to bargain and get us good deals. And how will that happen? When we get people that know what this is all about, when we get people that need to defend their country when the contracts are being made. So for that reason, for us at Makerere, like you mentioned in my CV, that's the reason we began that course. And we're going to do our best. We are going to make it very practical. Thank God for people like Bernard, people like my brother Olobo, who come and do the lectures. So what are we trying to achieve? In the next 3-4 years, we need to get people who are specialized so that in the MDAs, in the ministries, departments, and agencies, we have people that can generate proper PPPs. Okay. Now, let me go to the issue of the COVID implications. And this is, I may be generic a little bit. One of the things that PPPs have taught me is something called, COVID has brought on the table is a thing called critical thinking. The way things have been done before or for ages is going to change. And that one, we can't stop it. So that means anybody trying to do anything, either government or private sector, there's going to be a lot of critical thinking. What do I mean? You look at a task, you have a challenge, you think of a way to solve it. You must think that at every point of thinking, what can I use? Maybe you need to double think or triple. You need to cross-check everything you used to do before. For instance, nowadays, people used to hire office space. So the question is, do I need office space? So those people are going to be in PPPs must answer those questions. About PPPs, these are the questions we're going to be asking. Is this the best solution? And that is what actually Bernard highlighted, that when you go to the private sector can afford to be creative. Now, notwithstanding the creativity of private sector, even the public sector must get creative, okay? The issues of thinking things will be done as they were before, I think will not fly. Then the other thing would be that where we do PPPs, which PPPs should go ahead of others? One of the areas that now is at risk is the health sector. We visited a hospital in London, which was done under PPP, and the level of efficiency, and let me highlight this, in PPPs, we don't buy products, we buy a service. In other words, when the private sector comes on board, we don't buy from them a generator. We buy from them power that is lighting in our houses. Okay, now recall that one of them is a product, the other one is a service. In other words, you need to look at the whole spectrum from the power coming from the generator to the time it gets to your house. What does that mean? How easy is it to pay my bill? How do I know that I'm not being cheated? How efficient is the system? And that is the good news with PPPs. And that's why they will help a lot. There have been a lot of cry about public service delivery, oh, we don't have this, oh, the potholes, oh. You will notice that, like, for example, in the KJE, there are conditions, for example, if an accident happens on the highway, how long does it take to clear the way? How long is traffic obstructed? We visited a PPP in South Africa, the one that goes from South Africa to Mozambique, the N3 highway, the N3 or N4. And you see, there are people monitoring, there are cameras. They should know that when traffic is going slow, why is it going slow? And this is where the issue of service delivery comes in. If you go for a hospital, how long does a patient take waiting? What are the results? Why is it that diagnosis wasn't seen? So one of the areas that I want to highlight will be the issue of health. The other one is education. Somebody must come out of think outside the box and know that now that we can't look at the blackboard physically, what are we going to do? So I want to implore people who are on this forum that please let's think outside the box. For every sector, garbage collection, public transport, there are things you look at and say, surely this shouldn't be. The public keeps on complaining over these issues. So just identify where there is a missing link for the public, and then think through outside the box, bring it on the table like our colleague said, Bernard, make an associate proposal. Thank God our PPP director is here. He will be able to highlight how are these things handled. Then, of course, even as I finalize the issue of this webinar, the thing is becoming the norm that things are done on the internet, you know? So what does that mean for internet providers? What does it mean for you? Is there a sector that you can cave in and say, this is my part, this is what I can do? Now, that means that when you go into PPPs with that direction of think outside the box, you have a lot to explain. Sort of, you're going to have to detail out how everything will happen, because it's going to be starting from first principles. So generally, that's what I can highlight from the paper. And of course, it will take a while for us to go over this thing. But the whole point is going to come back to how do we think through our proposals? What are the challenges we have? How do you overcome them? The norm is gone. You know, you're calling it a new normal, but because the old one is gone. So I think that's what I can highlight from the paper, and I beg to submit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenneth. Indeed, a lot of learnings from you. And unfortunately, I know that you'll be leaving shortly. So I will beg your indulgence in maybe a question or two. When you look at the Q&A section, there is a Patience Atuhere who is asking which health projects are lined up for PPP. Then there is a Rhoda Rubaiza who is saying, are there any opportunities for PPP in the agriculture sector? And then those two speak to the question that I would like to ask you. And how do the missing links get processed? In your conversation and commentary, you've talked about we should look around, see the missing links, and then we exploit opportunities for PPP. So clearly for people like Patience and Rhoda, your response would help us. Is there a way that these ideas can be processed and handled? How does somebody who has an idea get it pushed through?
Okay. If I can answer it this way, that because PPPs pertain to service delivery, it will be very smart of you to begin at the end of the consumer, okay? And then drive it backwards. What do I mean? Is that you will ask, when somebody goes to a scenario, what are the challenges they face? People have a threat of wrong diagnosis. People have a threat of not seeing the right caliber of professional. Then, of course, the arrival and the way they are handled. So the point is, try and think through the service wholesomely, and that service being delivered to the consumer, and the consumer gets away happy. Once you work out those, the next thing will be, what does it take to provide that service? So it's quite some thinking, Paul, as you can imagine. It's more of, okay, these things have been done like this, but now, for example, recently, the banking sector, you notice like in the banking hall of Standard Chartered Bank, they have now a cafe. What was the whole idea? Is that where people are waiting, we used to queue and line up, but now you sit on your chair. Now that is service delivery. So for any person planning to go in a PPP, please mind the fact that the consumer is sort of the king. That's why I keep on saying that, because the bargain between public and private it should be at equal level. Government should never think I'm the big brother here, or no, the customer is the king. When the customer complains, and this is where it comes out very well, Paul, when the private sector invests money, that money does not come back in one lot. We pay it over the period of 30 years. And whenever we are going to pay a monthly payment, the questions will be, is the customer satisfied? If they're not satisfied, within our contract, the lawyers will put in clauses and say, if this happens, we will give you this penalty. So that's what keeps the private sector on their tiptoes. In other words, think through that process. Whatever they will see that you have pledged to deliver, you do not deliver, that means that they're going to fine you. So that is within the contract, the way we play that. So the point I'm making is, go back to service delivery. Figure out what impresses the customer and then work backwards.
So for the one who has worked all that through, what is their next step?
Okay, so what they will do then, they will put together an unsolicited proposal, which are welcome under section, I think, is it 34 in the Act, or where they say that when you prepare, if somebody has an unsolicited proposal, he will prepare it. And where does it take it to? This is one thing I'd forgotten to tell you. In the Act, PPPs are generated by MDAs who have the mandate by a statutory instrument. I'll tell you. National Council regulates higher education. That is their mandate. Okay. Ministry of Health, their mandate is health. So wherever you have your idea, look for the government body that has the mandate in the public or by virtue of law. NITA does technology, NERA registration, agriculture ministry, NDA medicine. So you look for that MDA and then you approach them with your idea, packaged very well, and then from there you will work with them to develop it and bring it to the unit.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Kenneth. Indeed, very enlightening. And we will be missing you on the discussion, but thank you for your contribution. And please, when you're ready to leave, feel free to leave at will.
Thank you so much.
We're with the discussion. We missed our poll questions. So for now, let's have our first poll question in today's discussion so that we can move on to the second discussant. And the poll question reads, how do you define PPPs? Is it a partnership between public entity and private entity? Is it long-term contract between a private party and government agency providing a public asset or service? Or is it a private party providing services directly to the public, for example, the telcos? How do you define PPPs? Let's have your contribution to the question at hand. We need to hear your views of definition. Indeed, listening to the first two discussants today, there's lots of learning and readjustments that may be required in our thinking, myself included. Thank you very much. I can see a lot of you are polling. We need those polls to come in. We have about 30 seconds to go on this poll. Kindly, how do you define PPPs? Make your view known on this. We need still more polling to come through. How do you define PPPs? Is it a partnership between public entity and private entity? Is it a long-term contract between a private party and government agency providing a public asset or service? Or is it a private party providing services directly to the public? For example, telcos. Let us hear your views on this so that we can have a meaningful poll. I still see a number of us have missed out, but 10 seconds to go on this poll before we can move on to the next activity and discussion in today's webinar. Thank you very much. I'll be now requesting that we end the poll so that we can hear the results. And the majority of us, 74%, think that PPP is a long-term contract between a private party and government agency for providing a public asset or service. And there is still 26% that think it is partnership between public entity and private entity. Thank you very much for participating in the polls. I just want to remind us all to make use of the Q&A section. I had a couple of people that were posting a few things, raising the hand. Unfortunately, on this webinar, we do not really have the bandwidth to take on verbal engagement with webinar attendees, but there is an opportunity in the Q&A section for you to make you known. I just want to encourage the panelists, please look at the discussions in the Q&A section that we may respond to the people who are responding. Discussant number 2 is Mr. Michael Opaji. Mr. Michael Opaji is the Africa Regional Manager, Public Private-Public Partnerships Advisory Services at the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank. Michael is SSA Regional Manager of the IFC's Infrastructure Advisory Services team based in Joburg. Before that, he led the IFC PPP Advisory Services team in Eastern Africa and has been involved in energy, ports, telecommunications, airport, and tourism mandates since joining IFC in 2007 in Joburg. He has served over 20 years of experience in economic development, public enterprise, and infrastructure sector reform, public-private partnerships, and privatization. Before joining IFC, Michael worked in the Ministry of Finance of the Government of Uganda, where he served as the director of the privatization unit. Michael also served on boards of financial institutions, utility companies, manufacturing concerns, and was the chairman of the Uganda Stock Exchange and the New Vision Printing and Publishing Corporation. He has led a team of senior officials and advisors in the development of policy and implementation of reforms, the introduction of private sector participation in transport, communications, financial, manufacturing, and the housing sector. Michael holds a Bachelor of Statistics and a postgraduate in computer science, as well as an MBA. Michael, you are welcome to comment on the paper and contribute to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much for the
Yes, we hear you, Michael. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first start by thanking Bernard for putting together this thought piece, and which is very helpful in garnering discussion around a very topical discussion, PPPs, especially around around COVID, the COVID pandemic, which has brought in to bear a number of weaknesses actually that have existed globally. The paper is very good at pointing out what role could be played by the private sector, especially considering the impact on government fiscal resources, as has been pointed out. And I think we cannot run away from the fact that we are really faced with a very grim immediate picture today. And yet we all appreciate and know that there is a need to solve this, and it's unavoidable. We have to do it globally, but also in sub-Saharan Africa. It is also true that the emerging markets are going to be impacted significantly during this period. I think one of the hardest things today is not knowing what the impact is over the medium to long term. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot more optimism. Today, there seems to be a lot more pessimism on how this is going to pan out. Is it going to be a W-shaped growth recovery program going forward? Is it going to be a long U? Is it going to be a shorter V? It's not clear, right? But I think from the outset, I think one of the things I'll point out is the common government misconception that PPPs is a way of getting funding from the private sector without responsibility or commitment from the government, i.e. pass the buck to the private sector. That needs to be reversed. There's a need to manage that expectation. I think Professor Semogere has alluded a lot more and spoken more on the private sector expects something, but the private sector is a lot jittery. And this will bring me to one of the points that is in the paper from Bernard, which is important to try and delve into a little bit more, which is that money today is a lot cheaper in developing countries where interest rates have gone to negatives. The reality of the matter is money is also very shy, and money will follow the least path of resistance. But to the extent that a number of PPP programs involve the private sector assessing the business environment and being able to predict a lot more clearly the markets over a period of time. It does raise the question whether it's just about the money. Is it about the certainty of the environment? Is it about managing the risk? What are the sponsors going to do? The money will go with the sponsors. The sponsors have to access that money. The sponsors have got to be able to assess these projects and determine whether or not this is bankable to be brought for financing. And so, what is the environment that PPPs are being developed, and is it going to be able to attract this private sector money? So I think there's a lot more dynamics in it that this has got to take into consideration. I would really ask that Bernard and his team delve a lot more into this, because it would be a misconception here that because money is cheap and therefore it's easier to develop the PPPs. The PPP is not just about the money being available, but it's also about the environment where that money is going into. Now, Professor Semogere also did point out to one aspect, which was the users. It's very important to understand what the user's role is going to be, about them paying and all. Question is about the revenue stream. I think that's what was more pointing out to. Now, because the pandemic has impacted income levels significantly at the user front, but also for fiscal, the fiscal space for governments have been significantly impacted. It does also raise the uncertainty question from the private sector in terms of sustainability, financial sustainability of these projects. But I think what would be useful is to look at how to start engaging, not just within government. The thought piece should go and cut across to the private sector. I think the private sector is a lot more creative and innovative in coming to solutions, working together with the governments. The worst thing that can happen, and this seems to be happening more and more, is governments going back into thinking through solutions without engaging the private sector to understand how best to go about bringing them on board and to be able to work through solutions that they are putting in place. Now, because governments are financially constrained as a result of COVID, to what extent, therefore, should government look to the private sector to try as much as possible, leverage its resources and bring in the private sector to be able to develop infrastructure where it is needed? But the second question more is, how does infrastructure development fit into the whole economic rebooting program that the government is looking into? Because there are a number of areas that are chasing after government meager resources today. Is infrastructure the way to go? I think the most important aspect today to look at is, first of all, to address market collapse. What and who would take responsibility in addressing the collapse of markets today and the impact on the income of the wider user community, especially to the extent that they will be the beneficiary for service delivery, whether or not the government or the user is paying. So how do we address that market collapse? There are certain sectors that have literally ground to a halt, transport and logistics being one of them, for instance. And there are some that are teetering on collapse as well, not to the extreme of transport. But if you look at, for instance, on the energy sector, I mean, they were talking about, Bernard did make a presentation on Umeme. So in the immediate term, they are definitely dealing with some issues because people are not paying the market, because most manufacturing concerns are not operational or are operating at below capacity. This is going to impact revenues. But in the medium to long term, what is going to happen? All right? What can be done to be able to address this? The worst thing that can happen is to try and not listen to the challenges that the private sector is faced with today, especially where you already have an agreement in place. It is true that Umeme would have borrowed from a number of financing institutions, and Umeme is a listed company on the stock exchange. What does it mean for Umeme today to be able to address the immediate challenges? What does it need to be able to support during this transition period so as to come out stronger at the other end, or at least keep the head above the water until the economy starts recovering? So it is clear that at this point is where government needs, during this this market recovery program, to invest a lot more to address some of the legal and regulatory areas that need to be supported, and the commercial areas that need to be supported to be able to maintain and give confidence to the private sector for the latter days. The private sector is watching. How the governments behave today will definitely trigger on how they're able to respond when when government feels like they need private sector to work with. And that is not to say that the private sector is not going to do anything. I think the private sector is going to be more responsive if they feel there is a listening government, and where they feel they can sit together to think through different solutions. The bigger challenge today is also that because of the challenges that are faced globally, there has tended to be now increasing protectionism and trade wars that are beginning to impact and will most likely impact the emerging markets even more. Now, to this extent, therefore, how do we ensure that with all of the restrictions that are being that are felt across the global economies, what can be done locally to, for instance, build credit? There has been a discussion, for instance, in the paper by Bernard, that NSSF could play a significant role on building up the financial market. The reality is, I think the reforms in the pension sector need to progress, and because this discussion has been going on for a while, and I'm aware, looking at the papers, that there is a question as to why these reforms are dragging. It's not just about NSSF, but it's also the other non-financial institutions that are mobilizing resources, the insurance sector and all. How can these institutions, how can these funds be put together to be able to mobilize funding to support private sector engagement, whether it's under PPP or otherwise, or even to support government programs going forward? And to the extent that those reforms are not undertaken, I think it might be a weak shot actually to keep pointing at NSSF. Let us look at the broader reforms that need to happen on the pension sector. These have been going on for the last 20 years. Uganda is one of the few countries in the Eastern Africa region that doesn't have a health insurance scheme, for instance. And there have been some that have happened that had been started by the private sector a while back and actually did collapse. Now some are beginning to creep up and looking at the more regional market. So what can be done differently to be able to build up this sector? Because local financing is true, and I think that's where Bernard is going in this paper, and I think we need to spend more time on this. Local financing is really very important. During this pandemic, we have, for instance, some of our colleagues in other regions like Latin America who have been able to financially close some deals during the pandemic, but mainly because bulk of the funds were coming from the local market. But how have the local markets grown over a period of time? Local markets have really grown because there have been reforms that have supported collective funds to be able to participate in investing in some of these programs. So today, there are some legal and regulatory constraints that do not allow, for instance, pension funds to invest in project-based in projects like I know KJE has been discussed also in the past. The reality is that those reforms have to happen, and they need to happen and happen quick. I do know, wearing my other hat, that for KJE, there are discussions around how to be able to put in place a local funding instrument so as to be able to support this project. That is going to go along with a discussion around whether or not there are any legal and regulatory restrictions to be able to undertake this and how this can be addressed. And I think that thinking needs to proceed and progress. And I think, Bernard, you and Jim Mugunga is on the call, and I think can play a very key role in trying to see what can be done differently. There have been a lot of discussions about infrastructure funds. So the question is, for infrastructure funds and creating infrastructure bonds, what does it mean, and how are we going to be able to utilize this to support development of PPPs? But the question also is, when is this going to happen? Is it going to happen at the time that we're addressing market collapse, or is it going to happen at the time that we're looking for recovery? I think PPPs are going to be more critical, and the private sector is going to be more prevalent in addressing solutions during the recovery phase, and not necessarily during this time of addressing and restoring markets. So that's what I have to say for now, but I'm available to continue the discussion for another hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And indeed, a lot of enlightening discussion on financing and the options and things that we need to look at. We'll go straight into the second poll question before we have our special guest have his commentary on the paper at hand today. So let's have the second poll question today, and then we will move into the discussion with our chief guest today. And the question reads, in your opinion, have public-private partnerships contributed to infrastructure development in Uganda? In your opinion, have public-private partnerships contributed to infrastructural development in Uganda? The answers are three: simply yes, no, or I don't know. In your opinion, have public-private partnerships contributed to infrastructural development in Uganda? Is it a yes? Is it a no? Or is your response, I don't know? Kindly make your view known in the poll that is going on for another 30 seconds. We really need all the views to come in, because the polls also help create a perception and give a picture of what the general feeling out there is. We need you to poll in next about 15 seconds before we show what many of us are thinking concerning this question. In your opinion, have public-private partnerships contributed to infrastructure development in Uganda? And the results read, yes, 58% think they have, 28% think they haven't, and there is a significant 14% that does not know. And I think part of the essence of this discussion today is to move that 14% away from either the yes or the no, as enlightening discussion continues to happen. And our chief guest today is Mr. Jim Mugunga. Jim is the Executive Director of the Public-Private Partnerships Unit and spokesperson of the Ministry of Finance, Planning, and Economic Development. He serves as a member on various boards as a director and accountability, contracting, and oversight committees. Jim is a highly motivated, skilled, optimistic, and accomplished certified public-private partnership member. He is also a communications and diversity specialist with a wide range of private and public sector experience of over 30 years. And over the last 16 years, Jim reskilled and redeployed his private sector experience and expertise into the public sector. He led teams in driving government policy on diversity, projects, contracts, and cross-functional teams and management roles. He has knowledge and expertise in creation of strategic partnerships and implementation of knowledge building and management systems in the private and public sectors, as well as financial and budget management. Jim prefers to refer to himself as the embodiment of your ordinary grassroots public servant. Why does he refer to himself as that? One, he started by working simply and humbly as a school teacher. Then he reskilled and used available library books to hone his writing and communication skills. He wrote articles, proved competitive, and diversity to eventually rise through the ranks to become one of the most respected Ugandan investigative journalists and communications practitioners. He became head of communications and official spokesman of Uganda's Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, and the privatization unit. He has significant broad experience in growing private participation in the public space. Public-private partnerships, investor relations, advocacy, communications, education and awareness, among others, are some of Jim's strengths. Jim, you are welcome to speak to the discussion at hand today.
Thank you very much and for that introduction. One, I think I'll start by really talking about CASO. It's my first time to relate, but I've seen your publications and invitations to talks like this. I think what you're doing is, for me, the beginning of what we should all be doing to ensure that we create this kind of awareness and engage in topical discussions, and particularly so on matters like these that are quite intriguing. I remember about 10 years ago, PPPs were never taught in school. And those who have followed the trend will know that you basically learned by doing. And maybe that explains why when you had Bernard Owundo speak, probably myself coming on, Michael Paji and others, you see a common factor of privatization. And that's where it all started. And therefore, I saw the poll question, which tried to ask people, what can you define PPPs to be? I think in Uganda, we've had quite an experience defining PPPs to be anything where the government is actually not involved, where the private sector comes in. Which brings me to the origin of where we come from. For those who have been around for quite some time, remember that at one time, Kampala City Council tried to get the private sector to run the taxi park. They never used the word PPP, but they said they will want the private sector in. And they gave away the taxi park. Eventually it led to wars, and the multiple agencies that run the park currently exist. Later, an attempt was made to try and get the private sector to play roles in the abattoir. We all know the experience of the Kampala abattoir, and that was an attempt at trying to get the private sector in. Later, after that, the markets, the story is known. When you go to Owino, there are about 5 major, very powerful, very well connected camps that run Owino market, Chiseka market, and Nakasero market. So the reason I'm bringing out this is to inform all of us that this is a journey. This is a journey that has evolved over a period of time. And it comes from the historical perspective where we as a country were. If I tend to normally go back in time, we got our independence in the 1960s. By 67, we had started fighting. we had wars. We had wars over cotton, we had wars over kingdoms, and so on and so forth. So almost zero stability. By 1970, we had the major fight, overthrowing the government and the Idi Amin Dada taking over. 67, 70, that's about 3 years. There's no stability, there's nothing that's happened. But the country, as we know it, thrived and lived off the capacities of colonial industrial commerce that prevailed then. But Amin, in his wisdom, decides to send away the Asians. These were the managers, they were the accountants, they were the lawyers, they were the cashiers, you know, the money people. So we send them away and the state starts to collapse. And, you know, that goes all the way from the 70s to 85. 1985, we, of course, the NRM comes in and we start on a journey of building from scratch because the economy stalled, everything stopped. And one of the pronouncements then was, we are a new young nation. We cannot be seen to be doing everything to sustain livelihood, look after security, but also grow the economy and do private sector role. Now, the relationship between PPPs and privatization and private staff involvement starts then. So government decides on the journey of divestiture. Now, I keep saying to people who give me an opportunity to speak that you'll never see any of these systems as a standalone and therefore weigh its performance as a unit. Privatization, liberalization, foreign exchange liberalization are all intertwined. They had to thrive off one another. And because of that, we literally experimented, I was then, but as a country, we literally, each one of them as a standalone. So we started driving things on their own. And hence, you'll see in other stages of privatization, concessions, you'll see things like share sales, asset sales, you'll see a lot of activities that are happening that are similar to what we do today, but they were experimentally to try and get in private sector. Government was overwhelmed, and therefore government decided to invite private sector to do what it does best in finance, management, and others, and then government will concentrate on the core business that government does best. Now, the reason I bring this historical perspective is to let us reflect on what eventually did going forward, and then create a relationship. It has everything to do with the preparedness of both government and hence public and the private. So you from the paper, I had a comment about preparedness of government, systems are not there, they are not working, but also we talked about private sector not being ready. I'm not disputing that, and I 100% agree, but the reason for that has everything to do with our history. And members of council would also know that hardly would you count 10 private sector institutions in the country that are so solid enough to participate in a project like Kampala Ginger at $1.5 billion. You wouldn't find them. One, either they don't have the money, or they don't have the capacities, or they are not documented. Even if, to go to quickly, I'll keep moving between Mike Awundo and Dr. Semogere. Even if you say, let's put all government resources and avail it private sector to enable them, as Bernard was saying, but they're not documented. The shareholders are not known. Their books of accounts are not kept. They are not willing to offer themselves to full disclosure. They don't want to go through a procurement system that is competitive because of reasons best known to them, because they have to disclose a lot of things. So when you put all these factors together, it speaks to the history that I've laid before, where we actually come from and where we need to be looking at before we actually talk about PPPs in the era of COVID. So I want to agree with Bernard. We actually, as an institution, the unit and the Ministry of Finance, have tried to build the systems. So moving on from privatization days to the PPP, we had a transitional issue. You could see, hearing the people who have been speaking and those who know, you realize that people like Michael Page speaking to us today, Emmanuel Nyirinkindi, who is in Washington, doing the same thing, Chris Orobo with IFC is Ugandan, Sebavi, David Sebavi, Orono Otweyo All these, Bernard, by the way, including Bernard, your own Bernard. Actually, Bernard is a defector. I don't know whether he went for greener pastures or what, but these are the people who have a history. Now, what we have with these capacities is that they're all locally grown. They lived through the process, they understood and experimented, including myself, and eventually we trained. My argument is that capacities are in a country. We lose them because A, we cannot retain them. We choose not to retain them. Two, we don't empower them. And that creates the deficit in the level of PPPs as talked about earlier. So I'll move on quickly, having laid that historical perspective, to discuss Bernard's paper. And allow me not to go through the description, definition. I agree with the Paul, but I also want to add that that definition is not cast in stone. The definition has evolved from one sector, rather one country to another, and it changes as the times go by. People have tended to innovate and come up with definitions that address their needs as a nation state. Now, I'll talk about progress at the unit. The unit has built a lot of internal capacity, building onto the works that were done in the days. Myself, 1 year, barely 1 year and a half at the unit. Unfortunately, when I took over, I inherited a blank screen. So I had to build all systems afresh, but good enough, we had the law. And with the help of my committee, we've come up with the regulations, we've come up with the guidelines. The guidelines, the regulations, the act are all accessible at www.pppunit.go.ug. And we really ready to go. That was a missing link. We were working on projects using best practice. There was no guidance in a young nation like ours, and therefore everything, moved the way it is. Currently, as we speak, we are ready to go. I agree with the numbers that Bernard has put up. Our current flagship project is Kampala Ginger, but normally the advice is start with the easy to bite chunks so that you deliver them quickly. Kampala Ginger is a lot more complex. But the good news is that DFIs are still on board. Yes, Bernard, I agree with the comments that the challenge of COVID may impact it, but we have commitment. All hands are back on. The reason we stalled was a lot more to do with our internal harmonization issues as a government, and not necessarily because of COVID impact. But as COVID, of course, is now a new challenge, the appetite, the timing is an issue for PPPs. Kampala Ginger was scheduled to have been at RFP stage by this time. We've wasted a year consulting. The implication of that is that after the year, COVID has hit us, and so our election cycle has come. Mike has talked about the readiness of investors to invest, but also they check out the destination for that investment. When they have uncertainty, when we're going through a political timeline like ours, election timeline, you tend to see a slowdown a bit. They hesitate to move in until such issues are resolved. So that's an issue. That's an issue we have to deal with. But again, our constitution and mandates at the executive are such that you have to consult all bodies that must be consulted. You cannot jumpstart a process like this one, and nobody will touch it anyway when there are questions that are still lingering. So we've gone over that, and we believe that Kampala Ginger will soon go to the market. We are ready with the RFP. We are ready to issue it. Our DFIs are on board. Our commitment for VGF, I'll be speaking to that later, it still remains. And we're very optimistic that Kampala Ginger will come on board. I wish to comment about the progress of LERE. I think, Bernard, in your paper, I noted that you spoke about, when you're talking about PPs historically, you talked about our Rift Valley and talked about KJE in the same line. The issues with the Rift Valley, we tend to interchangeably use Rift Valley, LERES, SGR, the new hospital that is being rebuilt at Luowa, and others of the kind as PPPs. On one side, I agree because they present a semblance of qualities of PPPs. But on the other, which is an academic question, which I believe Kaso and Dr. Semoge and others will take up as an academic question, is I think the tenants of a PPP are not evident in some of these projects. And therefore, the things that hurt them are avoidable to the extent that we structure the transaction as an ideal PPP. And I don't want to bog down the audience by speaking to the methodologies you use, but the fact are, if you put the current Rift Valley Railway under the divestiture law and try to look at it from a PPP perspective and what it should have been, then you realize the differences. And those differences are so fundamental. Some of them are risks, and some of them are actually omissions or commission that shouldn't have been. But in the framework of the law then, they worked for the purposes, for the time and the law that was used to deliver those solutions. So what I urge you, discussants and other observers, is never to look at a transaction from the current, but look at it from the time when it was structured. What are the expectations then? What was the structure used? And what were the commitments then? Now, the moment you look at it in the current, then you're going to have to deal with so many other issues because you are better informed and the timelines have shifted and moved. So that's an issue I thought I would clarify on railways. I also agree with Bernard. Yes, we're moving on. We've decided to diversify our efforts. We've moved on with the low-hanging fruits, easier to deliver projects. Guru Logistics Hub is a very good project. We believe we are going to do it. We're doing that one in association with Trademark East Africa. The purpose for that is to have a logistics hub in Gulu town along the former Uganda Railways line. It should be able to function to serve delivery of goods into Gulu, so you don't actually have to come to Kampala and run the trucks all the way from Kampala, from Arua Park to Gulu, but you have the trucks running up to from Nairobi, Mombasa to Tororo, and then branching off on the rail when it's built up to Gulu. We're very optimistic that this will work, but also know that it will, kickstart our operations in greater northern Uganda, beyond that to South Sudan and the DRC. We also believe that that hub will function to help us alleviate transportation or logistical issues when the oil fields are eventually explored and they start to deliver. We have other projects in the energy sector. We have projects in the water sector. The water sector is a very popular project for the arid zones, the arid areas. So I saw a question on agriculture. We believe that agriculture can thrive where water is also available, and these two projects are interrelated and we are working on them. The project in the National Council of Sports is a redevelopment of the council. Speaking to Bernard's observation, the capacities are at the center, but the capacities at MDS to develop bankable projects are hardly there. So the National Council of Sports has had about 2 or 3 attempts at just procuring a transaction advisor. For those who know PPPs, that is literally the starting point of rolling out of technical abilities to deliver PPP. Now, where you have procurements that go wrong at that stage and you do it 3 times, that speaks to the capacity issues that we have. And that's the demonstration of the issues we are dealing with. I've not lost hope. We're creating a lot of capabilities. Dr. Semogele's institution is helping out with the training. The department I head, I supervise, we're trying to go down. We actually COVID, now to talk about the challenges of COVID is told us in our way. We had covered all MDAs. We are creating focus centers. We are creating project teams in ministries, departments, and agencies of government. And we had started on a road trip that is going to cover the whole of Uganda to now look out and reach out to local governments. We did the Eastern Uganda and we stopped heading to the north because of the lockdown. Now, allow me to move to the challenges in the country. And I believe that I should be speaking to the cost. I've just talked about the issue, the challenges of getting in the case of National Council of Sports, Posta Uganda, to get those projects onboarded as PPPs. The problem is technical capabilities. People tend to think that because he's a lawyer or somebody is a finance person, therefore they'll be able to do these projects. It's a lot more than that. You're structuring a deal, a transaction that is going to be 25 years alive with you. You have to forecast that further, and you have to have a team that is going to run with it from year 0 to year 25. They may not necessarily be the very people, but they should have the ability to look that far. And this is the issue we have with projects of this nature. I'll give you an example of a project we built. Michael Pagi was at the forefront of this. Kampala Serena, people tend to forget that's a Uganda hotels product. It belongs to government of Uganda. Kampala Serena used to be called Nile Hotel. Myself and Michael Pagi, on a certain day, I tend to forget, but I'll never forget it in life. We sat at Kampala, by then Nile Hotel, and counted spoons, plates, and everything we had to hand over to TPS. In the night, we had to hand over at midnight. And that process woke me up on the realities of what you actually do when you're doing transactions. We counted everything, but also we saw the damage beyond the front that customers, clients of the hotel used to see. So when you walk into a hotel, you see the front, the beauty, the chairs, and the reception. But what goes on behind and the outlook behind there, you would never know. So we had an access. We had access, we went in there. And I can attest to the fact that it was completely rotten, but it was operational. It was the hotel for Ugandans and foreigners alike. So we handed over. And we built into that structure a revenue stream that goes back to government from gross revenue. So for 25 years of the Aga Khan, through his company TPS, operating Serena Hotel, government of Uganda earns a revenue. But we also committed TPS to give us a 5-star hotel. Now, what we didn't do to them, we didn't say we need a building that is 1, 2, 3 floors. We had the main structure, which was a white structure overlooking the gardens, but we said we needed a 5-star hotel because we knew it was within our competences to describe what a 5-star hotel is. More than 3 restaurants, these amenities, so many presidential suites and so on. We did not structure the size of the presidential suites, but wanted something that qualifies for a presidential suite and other amenities, swimming pool and so on. And then we put that bid out there. And the private sector innovated, to use Bernard's word, and competed around delivering the solution we wanted. Now, I'm using Serena as an example of what exactly you do in PPPs. When you look at that from the perspective of the other infrastructure, what do we do ordinarily in the other infrastructure? We say, I need a 400-bed hotel, I need 5 floors, I need 2 lifts, and you prescribe. Any architect on earth, any engineer will be able to deliver that because that's what you've asked for. Now, what we did so many years ago is the Serena we have. So the forecast for 25 years has delivered that Serena, kept to the business plan, and it's just the work of government to just monitor and follow through. And then we used sensitivities to come to the figure we came for that gross revenue charge that we get. Now, it's important to look at that from the perspective of the difference between PPPs and other procurements and see whether we are actually incapacitated to deliver them. I strongly believe we are not incapacitated from a commitment point of view, but we are incapacitated from the will to do it. Some of these projects can actually be done if we choose to do them, but the will to do them and commit resources towards doing them is the missing factor. So when Bernard speaks to things like cost of executing PPPs, the will is there. We did it when we did Serena and others, but and we had money. That's why Mike was able to deliver Serena, because we had money to hire transaction advisors. But the will to do them now is missing because the law, after being written, it actually creates a very good framework we can use. But the Project Development Facilitation Fund, as Bernard pointed out, has 0 money in it. In other words, I can speak to the day, and Bernard and Mike will all talk about the goods and the things and how to do it. But to the extent that the people who need these projects have not committed money, either budgeted for projects that they want to do in a natural budgeting cycle, to be able to factor that project in. So if the project is in tourism and you need to do culture sites, from the day one when you're budgeting for the financial year, include the cost of delivering that project, transaction advisory cost, so that you're able to commit yourself to do it. But they don't. As Mike said, what people now think, and which we are struggling with, is the belief from day one that PPPs, people walk in with the money And therefore, they'll put money towards a problem and the problem will go away. They don't walk in with money. They walk in with money to a project that's bankable, that is viable, that will give them a return. That is so core, that's the key. Now, the problem with that perception is that it all starts with our legislative frameworks. The moment we get a word like PPPs, it does not become a functional solution word. It gets politicized. So we throw it around as a political statement, and in the process, we miss the ingredients that shape it. So somebody will actually say, oh, we are going to start up a district in Zombo, and the district headquarters will be built through PPP. So it's a political statement. But whether actually Zombo district headquarters are viable for purposes of a private sector investing in building the headquarter building becomes the discussion when we are setting them up. So those are issues that we have to deal with. We're engaging and we'll keep engaging. Now I'll move quickly to the other costs. The other costs and the solution to them. The solution to that kind of cost is to create capacities that can be shared. I can attest to the fact that with the help of IFC, World Bank, and others, we are beginning to create capabilities. In my own unit, we've recently undertaken a very big procurement of technical people whom we are going to retain for 2 years. And those are going to work with us to work with the ministries, departments, and agencies to deliver projects that we can actually take to the market. But we're also creating those competences at the center, and we're assigning them to ministries so that each unit has a set of ministries, and the ministries are expected to have project teams. The project teams will function within the ministry. Now, my expectation, and I believe the authorities that will allow this to happen, is to retain those project teams to run through the ministry and multiply their services through multiple projects. In other words, as we speak, for example, we have capabilities that I trust that in Uganda Revenue Authority, Uganda National Road Authority. If we used those competences to do Kampala-Jinja Road, there's nothing that would stop the Ministry of Works to adapt to the same project team to help it structure road projects in the Ministry of Works. But we are so compartmentalized as a nation that at times, we tend to operate in silos. And the PPP unit is trying to break that. We're trying to say, and we'll hopefully, Castle, you may want to adapt to this as one of the recommendations, that these competences that are in there can actually be used across the breadth of services that are needed in the ministry. UNRWA is such an example. The other example is we worked with the JILOS team, which is a very good, well-motivated team, which is working on a project in JILOS. My proposal again would be in any project that falls around the JILOS sector, there's nothing really wrong for us to commit those resources around those projects. And therefore, we'll then start multiplying them. So that will go a long way to alleviate the issues we have on technical advisory and the competences in MDAs. Now, there are also constraints in the private sector. And these constraints, as I said, are historical. And the truth is they're also current. Documentation. The private sector in Uganda, the truth is changing, forced by the laws and forced by disclosure. Uganda Revenue Authority increasingly is boxing the private sector to be able to document. So your returns must be made in time, therefore you have to keep books of accounts. You have to have a TIN number, and increasingly these are coming through. When we converge national identification, revenue identification, and and banking and other operations, you eventually have that convergence, and therefore will be documented. But until that happens, we have that challenge. So structurally, we are weak as a private sector to engage in PPPs, not because we don't have the will, but we're not able to meet the test. And the test is simple. You have to disclose. If you don't disclose, you have no role in PPPs. And that is fundamental because it's a marriage for 25 years. I know that Dr. Magara on the other side serves on the religious sphere of things. If you don't fully disclose to your spouse and you live with a sin or something hidden for 25 years, that marriage will not work. whether you want it or not, it will definitely collapse. So this is what I'm saying. Most of our institutions are not creditworthy. They cannot produce 3, 4, 5 books of accounts that speak to their banking history, their credit history, and therefore nobody can touch them. So these are problems that we have, and we have to deal with them as we move on. Allow me to move to the other thing I wanted to point out are the limitations of the private sector. And I'll just give you a quick example. Kampala Ginger. Recently, I tasked my officers, I said, look, guys, we are going into RFP, which means we need to increasingly structure the RFP to make sure that local content is catered for. So my question to them was, can one of you mention to me one company that can deliver 50 trucks that can move Maram or move aggregate along the corridor, so that we use examples and cite real people, real companies, and put them on the table and make a case for them for local content involvement. Up to today, I'm still waiting for an answer. Now, this is a demonstration. I'm not talking about shareholding equity contribution at SPV level as the previous speakers have said. I'm looking at sub SPV level, the lowest in the range. We are talking about $1.5 billion. If some of that money is along the chain benefiting a Ugandan company, I'll be more than happy. But what I was saying is, give me a company that can move 50 trucks at a go. Now, the test is that company must have them on their record books. They must show their maintenance history. They should have certified drivers, and of course, insurance for those trucks. Up to today, I've not got the answer. By demonstration, I'm trying to prove to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we have a lot to do to our private sector to get them to a level where they can play in this role. Now, what happens? In a situation like this, somebody will come, organize the local trucks we have, truckers, put them under one pool, and literally have ownership of them. And then they'll go to a village along the corridor of the road and buy out a rock and say, I'm going to supply. And the people with this kind of muscle will definitely be either foreigners or somebody who has big cash and not necessarily Uganda. So we need to work on the private sector, local private sector. It keeps popping up. And I'm a strong believer that, yes, we need to have them on board. But I'm also a strong believer that they need to be very organized, and we need to find a way of organizing them. It's my duty, it's your duty, it's everybody's duty to make sure that they are organized to deliver and play on the bigger stage. My comment on Umeme, I think Bernard, you spot on. The challenges are there, and these challenges will definitely live with us. I strongly believe that the lawyers must be now operating in very fertile ground, trying to define whether COVID-19 is a pandemic and therefore falls under the threshold of definition under the contract, or whether it can be redefined differently. It also presents a new phenomenon that going forward, when we are talking about force majeure and others, we're potentially going to have to rethink. Now, PPPs are good in such a way that it's all about risk allocation. Where you think this is a risk that a nation can take on or nobody will take it on, then you document like that. What is happening is that I think a reconciliation is going to happen on this one. The good news is that government is proactive. Umeme was a long-term concession, but we've already started negotiation, I think 8 years before it ends. That shows that what Mike spoke to, the government is sensitive to the fact that certainty should be guaranteed. The shareholders, the public listed company, the shareholders in Umeme and others need certainty for the years beyond the 8 years to go to be able to continue investing and engage with government. And in light of COVID, it's now even more urgent for us to conclude these negotiations. So I agree with Mike that yes, the certainty must be created. And I wanted to mention here that actually this negotiation is going on. I'm not at liberty to discuss the issues, but what I know is that it's going on, and that shows the appetite by government to engage, but also the forecast going forward to the realization that we need to get Umeme to have the comfort that they have an opportunity to still play a role going forward, or even retire themselves from the project. And we also need that window of certainty where we are going as a government, so that either we start talking to others or we conclude talks with UMEME so that we are certain. So I agree those issues are there, but the fact that we are discussing with UMEME is also a plus, and that goes to government. Now, for purposes of clarity, Bernard, Kampala Ginger, we actually received about 12 bids, 8 bids, pre-qualified, and the 4 were shortlisted. It's not 6. The disruption, as I said, was a lot more to do with engagements internally, and trying to make sure that we consult the government. I've just been looking across to a document, and what I know is that we are at RFP stage, and as soon as we conclude the internal discussions, we'll get there. The biggest impediment has been political consultation. In Uganda, our laws are written in such a way that you really consult a broader spectrum of stakeholder interests. And of course, you cannot demean or discount the role of Parliament and what it can do to any project. What Mike spoke about, certainty of the destination, where money is going, money watches that destination, is a very fundamental thing. It's not basically the risk of, but things like a legal framework, political issues, and so on. And that's at play in this case. So, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that in the case of UMEME, rather KJE, the biggest challenge is actually one where we have zero control, but must trust the legal system to resolve it, is the land issues along the corridor of the road, where the road is going to be constructed. There are such phenomenal challenges that even if you deal with them, you still end up with another issue, an embargo or a caveat or something thrown in the middle of the process because of the court process. So Bernard, who is a lawyer, I want to believe that he's well positioned to advise how can we get over this. But we respect the rule of the law, and where somebody says, look, yes, you paid me, yes, you valued my land, but I believe I got shortchanged, and he goes to court, we can only resolve that by court. Finally, on the unsolicited bids, again, talking to Bernard's proposal, I agree, Bernard, innovation, and we believe the private sector is more pressed to innovate. People like those in Silicon Valley, in Uganda as the innovation hub, all of them are private sector people, majority of them. Rarely do you find the government doing it. The government is good at governing and doing other things. The innovation is basically based on the private sector. But I also still think that we have to be a bit careful with unsolicited bids. And maybe that's the reason in the law, a bit of stringent clauses were put. In the case of Uganda, unsolicited bids have not actually been innovations. They've been people reading the National Development Plan, picking projects that are not funded, unfunded projects, and proposing them to the same government that identified them. And they want to cash in. And when it comes to that kind of approach, we have to be very careful. We need to put those projects to test. Now, the test, basically what we do in the unit, we say, if you have a proposal that you think is good for the country, bring it on. But we're not going to pay the price you want. We're going to subject that proposal to a test to see what would the market pay to deliver that very proposal. At the moment we do that, if it is within range, then we are good to go. If it is your proposal is higher than the range, we ask you to bring it down. Yes. Or if we think it's so fundamental that it's really viable, then we can negotiate or give you bonus points because you are the originator of the proposal. Now that does not discourage unsolicited bids, but what it does is it allows people to innovate, but be sure to be subjected to competition. If you don't do that, then the government, the other P, it's a PPP, public-private. The other P, the public, will be taken advantage of. So the law is written in such a way that we try as much as possible to avoid people taking advantage of government, because we also duty bound to protect government. So I agree that we need to encourage government, our private sector to innovate, but I also agree that we need also to protect government so that they get value for money for these projects. Quickly
Yes,
to speak
Mr.
to...
Sorry, Mr. Mugunga, I think we have about 2 minutes so that we can allow the public commentaries in respect to the time that we have left. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I'll wrap up. On NSSF, yes, unfortunately, it's the only NSSF. And I talked to somebody recently. NSSF, UDB, UDC have also, all of them have the similar challenges. NSSF have deeper pockets. UDB increasingly is getting in money, but bankable projects are not there. People don't structure projects. It's a common problem. It's something we have to deal with. I'll not elaborate, but I know that NSSF on average annually gets 50 projects. Hardly do they pass the test, but we are looking at only one entity. The other pension funds, as Mike said, also should be brought in because of through the ongoing pension sector reforms. This must be heightened, I agree. I'll give you an example. Makerere University at one time was one of the biggest holders of real good money. That money sat at National Insurance Corporation. How I know is because Mike and myself and others worked on the listing of the IPO of National Insurance Corporation. Makerere University decided to move the money to Print Bank for reasons best known to them. That money would have been invested in long-term projects, guaranteed return, and so on. So that's a clear example of what happens when you don't reform the sectors. A quick one, which is the last part of last part of my presentation, is why would we have to adapt to PPPs? Dr. Magara and the others, I will use Dr. Magara as an example because the COVID experience has really brought the realization that we need them. The health sector has been hit, but we still operate as business as usual. I'll give an example. A good hospital will definitely have other units, including a dental department, cancer department. What we do, we choose to procure everything, equipment, on budget. We don't have the resources to throw at all the equipment we need. PPPs would have presented an opportunity for us to stock, to lease equipment, and we guarantee numbers through the patient records we have. You're able to tell, if you talk to Dr. Magara, I presume, that in Uganda, the demand for dental services are so many numbers. The demand for cancer patients is so much. And therefore, I really doubt and wonder why, for example, a dialysis machine should sit on any hospital's books of accounts, as opposed to being leased through a PPP arrangement, a lease arrangement. So we need to explore the benefits and the opportunities that PPPs present to sort out the health sector, given the COVID-19 issues. I really want to rush through this and say, as I finalize, that we are looking at tourism. We've talked about ecologies. We've talked about investments in Renzori. I saw a question quickly, if you could allow me to answer that question on agriculture. The question on agriculture was whether the opportunities in agriculture. I'll answer by saying, yes, we are working on a project for fruit factory, and we are working on others that have been proposed. The problem has also been always that not all PPPs are viable and affordable. PPPs are life cycle costed. So when you cost everything and the PPP is not within a range to be able to be used or afforded by public, then you have to bring in some other financing options that bring down the cost of delivering of those projects. So this is an engagement, and therefore, on the public side, we are doing that, but also looking on the public side to make some monies available that can bring down that cost, so that these new projects in places like tourism, in areas like roads, some roads like toll roads, are worked on within the range that they are affordable and can be used. It's a risk to do a PPP project and the majority of the population cannot use it. It's a very big risk and would discourage anybody trying to do it. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Mugunga. And indeed, your discussion has elicited so many questions and comments. If you could help in the interest of time, in the meantime, on the Q&A room, to go in and respond to those Q&A chats that are available there. We will have the next poll question and then quickly delve into a bit of those questions in the Q&A discussion. And the poll question reads, what, in your opinion, is the greatest hindrance to the successful implementation of PPPs in Uganda? What, in your opinion, is the greatest hindrance to the successful implementation of PPPs in Uganda? Is it a skills deficit? Is it procurement delays? Is it corruption? Is it limitations in the availability of long-term financing? What, in your opinion, is the greatest hindrance to the successful implementation of PPPs in Uganda? Is it a skills deficit? Is it procurement delays? Is it corruption? Is it limitations in the availability of long-term financing? Kindly make your voice known on this particular poll question. And immediately after this, we will get into a few of those questions and others before we bring this discussion to a close. Indeed, it's been a very enlightening and educative discussion thus far. We are looking to close the poll in the next 20 seconds. What, in your opinion, is the greatest hindrance to the successful implementation of PPPs in Uganda? Skills deficit, procurement delays, corruption, or limitations in the availability of long-term financing? The poll comes to an end just about now. And interestingly, the majority of us think that corruption by 43% is the greatest hindrance to PPPs, followed closely by limitations to the availability of long-term financing at a 30%, then skills deficit at 18%, and procurement delays at a 10%. And indeed, these are the questions that face us as Ugandans as we work towards improving our community and society. And we go straight to the questions that have been coming in, and some of them that have come in through other channels. And the first question that I will ask, perhaps Michael, you will take a go at this, but then we'll also have Jim's commentary on this. What is the role of the investment authority in this entire PPP? What is the role of the investment authority, if there is any, that it plays? Michael?
Thanks, Paul. So in terms of what the role of investment authority is, so look, I think we've got to look at it from the PPP development cycle. At the tail end, when a project has been structured properly and is ready to go to market, looking out and reaching out to the targeted investors is a very critical aspect. So investment authority is very good at that as well. The second part is investment authority is responsible for some of the investment developing the investment environment for Uganda, for instance. Yeah, and so a number of areas associated with incentives for private sector investment look at areas where, as I believe investment authority is a one-stop center, where there are areas that need to be addressed, maybe on the tax side and all. Investment authority does play a very significant role in that. Investment authority also does help investors in being able to support them in the licensing and registration of critical aspects and of the projects. So I think the investment authority is critical for the whole PPP cycle development. And I think there's always been an interaction, and we have engaged with them in my capacity today when we're discussing, just get a better sense of what is being undertaken from the investment authority side and what kind of plans are being put in place to support private sector. But I'm sure Jim would have a much better answer to that.
All right, Jim, briefly, if you can comment on that question.
I agree with Mike. The only thing I can add is that investment authority, engages with a cross-section of investors, potential investors and lenders, whenever they go on these world tours to try and position Uganda. And therefore, they have this catalog of feedback that they can bring back and use within a discourse within government to point out what incentives or any other changes that we could do to undertake to enable investments to be undertaken in PPPs. So I think the role cannot be underestimated, but they also function as a collection of all investment opportunities in the country. So they're dealing with direct investments, they're dealing with PPP investments, they're dealing with all sorts of procurements, and they have a platform and reach. What we've done is to actually engage with them. Some of these promotions and investment opportunities can be co-promoted. We did that, Mike, if you could remember, when we had privatization projects, we could run them alongside with and co-sponsor roadshows with the Uganda Investment Authority to make sure that as a country we move in tandem and move together. And it really produced the results. So I think Investment Authority shouldn't be seen as an isolation, but should be seen as part of the enablers for moving PPPs forward. We could work together, and that's one way of removing the silos.
Thank you so much, Jim. There's another question from Dr. Monica Musenero. At the moment, the government is struggling with trusting the private healthcare system as a stakeholder in the current public health crisis caused by COVID. The private sector, including those with PPP agreements, are not trusted with testing and treating cases. How can we leverage PPP in delivering such heavy-duty issues like nationwide care of patients? The key issues seem to be trust and cost. What's your comment on this, and how do you advise government to handle this? I think you hinted a bit on insurance systems within East Africa and Uganda being behind. Could you make some comment on this one?
I think there has always been, let me just start by make a broader comment. There has always been a misconception that government is the largest provider of healthcare services. I was privy to a report that was undertaken by the Health in Africa team as part of the World Bank Group. And what was surprising is that the bulk of services were actually provided by the private sector. I think one of the challenges was that the bulk of these were not regulated enough, and the government felt there was necessity in investing in the more hard infrastructure and mostly the service delivery at different levels. Now, is there a possibility for further engagement with the private sector in healthcare delivery? I think that is very pertinent. I do recall Jim did point out that, look, there are so many ways that you can work with the private sector to deliver some of these services. One of the more interesting things we did note, for instance, was that procurement, for instance, of equipment for hospitals was done on a regular basis, replacement as and when it was necessary. But then you could as well buy it as a service. Get, for instance, diagnostic services to be delivered by the private sector to a hospital. Are these mechanisms being explored? I think they should be explored further. Is there a role for private sector to play during this COVID testing? Yes, there should be. Now, in terms of what decision is required to be able to undertake that now, in terms of response to COVID, that is a political economy decision that is being made in different countries. In some countries being done by private sector, and some countries being done by the public sector. I think the response actually varies. I would tend to try and move it away from the current immediate response and say what can be done medium to long term in being able to harness what the private sector can actually do to support private healthcare service delivery, because the reality is today, the private sector does a lot more out there than what the government is doing, although the government seems to spend a lot more on the larger and high-end infrastructure support, and especially at the rural areas where there is supposed to be where supposed to be that service delivered in that aspect, but it can also be done with the private sector. And this has to be thought through very carefully, though, on how this can be done together with the private sector. But this is possible.
Thank you so much, Michael. And Bernard, there was a question that came in from Jennifer Mujiche saying that what is the difference between privatization and the deal PPP? From the response of evaluating whether Uganda has benefited from PPP, there seems to be misunderstanding of privatization that was done by the Ugandan government and the realities of PPP. It's a question that came in from Jennifer Mujuche, and I think one of the discussants, it must have been Michael, and I think Jim have touched a bit on that, but just make a couple of comments, Bernard, on that.
Thank you, Paul. I think what is very fundamental is that privatization usually involves corporate scale. PPPs usually have you have private sector participation for a short term. For long term, really, you have concessions and you have many types of PPPs. What always confuses people is that, you see, under the Public Enterprise Reform and Divestiture Act, there were modes of divestiture which were agreed to, which are in the Act. One of the modes of divestiture was a concession. So you will find that, yes, a concession exists under the Public Enterprise Reform and Divestiture Act. And yes, a concession is a form of a PPP. So when we are looking at PPPs, and I think Jim was trying to make the fundamental difference between the Rift Valley Railways concession and the concession which will be done under the new PPP Act. There is a certain method and analysis that is put through for you to be able to implement a PPP as envisaged under the PPP Act. That sort of rigorous analysis was not there in the Privatization Act, which was the Public Enterprise Reform and Divestiture Act. And that is why I think Jim was saying, when we look at those concessions that were done under the PAD Act, we must look at them with a pinch of salt when we apply them to PPPs. So there is a clear difference in terms of the methodology that was undertaken for those that were done before. In terms of the benefits, I think it's a mixed bag. You have the Umeme concession. I mean, with all its challenges, we are where we are now because of the electricity distribution concession. On the other side, you have the Rift Valley Railways concession, which was terminated, but also that has some level of analysis that one needs to think through on whether the private sector could actually invest in the permanent rail. Should we have concession RVR using O&M? Just say, maybe call the private sector to just do O&M and don't require him to invest in the permanent rail, because investing in rail is highly capital intensive. If you require the private investor to invest that amount of money, how long should the concession period have been? Okay, so those are the questions also around RVR and whether it is necessarily a bad example. So in terms of the benefits of privatization, yes, there are challenges, but there are also benefits. When you look at Nile Hotel concession that Jim referred to, I think you're better now placed to go to Serena than the Nile Hotel that was before. When you look at the challenges that were there during UEB days, you're better placed to say yes, whereas Umeme has some challenges, but the private sector has certainly provided some sort of benefit. I think that those are the comments on privatization and PPPs.
Thank you, Bernard. And this question elicits another one from me. When you see some of the questions that have come up around these distinctions that have been drawn in this discussion, it leaves one wondering what can be done to improve the communication between government on explaining some of these things to the general population. Because one of the key things in doing successful projects is creating population buy-in. And it's amazing that the people on this call and on this webinar, most of them sit in the category that you would have expected to understand these distinctions well, but it's quite obvious they don't. What would be your word of advice on improvements in that space of communicating to the public over some of these important things?
Thank you, Paul. That's a very fundamental point. And I think I've participated in, the World Bank has done what we call a transparency and disclosure framework to majorly address, if we are going to do PPPs and get buy-in, can we involve the public and inform them of where we are at each stage of the process? You heard Jim say that actually 6 people were pre-qualified or 8 people were pre-qualified. Are we giving that information to the public so that you don't wake up one morning and say, you know what, people, tomorrow we are actually concessioning a railway to X, Y, and Z. How effective can we do that? So the World Bank has come up with a transparency and disclosure diagnostic report that has been done, and I think the PPP unit is going to be able to use that. I'll leave Jim to address that issue on whether they're actually implementing the transparency and disclosure framework. But that sort of addresses the concerns around public buy-in, okay, of these PPP projects. But also one of the issues you've raised is a communication strategy. Even during this pandemic, how are you speaking to the public about the challenges facing Kampala-Jinja Expressway? Because one of the things you don't want to do is wake up one morning and say, now we are done with the process. Then you'll get one member of parliament who will go to the floor and say, you know what, this KJE is very expensive. Then they'll create another ad hoc committee to investigate what was done. As a result of all that, time is moving, and then the project is not implemented. And while you're doing that, the private sector is watching. It just increases the cost of your project because the private sector will actually add that risk premium on some of these challenges that we have as a country. So it is very important to have a communication strategy. I think Jim would be better placed to answer whether that transparency and disclosure framework is being followed. I have not been able to see some of the input into, for example, Kampala-Jinja Expressway. So I think it is important for government to actually use that transparency and disclosure framework. It will assist the public to buy in these transactions. Thank you, Paul.
And Jim, I'm coming to you immediately on this one, but as you prepare to respond to that and add some value, let me ask these two questions about capacity, so you'll comment on them as well. There was a question that asked, James, as the people in charge of PPP, what are you doing about building local private sector capacity to benefit from PPP projects? Is there a strategy in your unit to address this? It reminds me that we also have a boo-boo policy at Ministry of Trade, and we keep saying no local capacity until 2040, and we still make this observation. There are also a few private local companies in Uganda who have struggled on their own to build capacities. And if indeed we discuss PPP, it should start from planning and strategizing on how to build local capacity. Then the similar question comes in from Mr. Patrick Rubongoya. He says, I think expecting companies to build capacity well in advance without assurance of business is a primary condition, is being unfair to the private sector. The foreign companies come from whole different backgrounds. Many who did so in anticipation of the oil and gas sector have burned their fingers. Isn't this putting the cart before the horse? So Jim, on those two questions on communication and on capacity building, kindly speak to us.
Thank you very much. On the first one, on communication, I would say that we try as much as possible for every project in its formulative stage to have, actually one of the submissions is a communication plan. So that's an obligation that projects that are being initiated at conceptualization level must indicate how the project is being developed and how the public is being involved. But I also understand we need to strike a balance. We need to strike a balance with what we say, where and when. As I said at the start earlier, rather, we run a very involving consultative process on the public side. And that process includes talking within ministries, talking to cabinet, going to parliament. Now, at that stage, what is public is actually parliamentary debate because it's done in public. But what happens in cabinet is exclusive to cabinet. You have to respect that. So some of these stages of development of a project have to go through that, and we need to allow some of these processes to happen, because if we don't, then you're running a project in an open field and you will never take off. So you strike a balance. Now, I also agree with Bernard. Yes, we've actually gone beyond just a disclosure framework. We have full disclosure on fiscal commitment and contingent liability. What happens is we contract these projects, but Ugandans don't actually know how much they are in on debt side of things with these commitments. So the PPP side, what we've done is to develop an FCCL, which is a public document, which can be accessed from our website, when a project reaches a stage where we have to disclose this, all this disclosure must be done. So transparency, disclosures must happen. Now, the last one, which actually creates a lot more problems, and we are, again, lawyers, Bernard keeps fluctuating from being a PP practitioner to being a lawyer, the lawyers tend to want to undertake something called a non-disclosure clause within the contracts for protecting themselves, but also protecting government. And I really think this is something you need to respect. So the elements in the contract and the structuring of these transactions, because these are huge transactions, that must be protected for purposes of allowing the structuring to happen. But at the stage when you're nearing implementation, major milestones, you definitely have to communicate. So we've communicated about the expressions of interest for KJE. They are documented, they are public domain. We've disclosed pre-qualification stages and the names are known, they're in public domain. I don't think I'm holding on to something that's not known when it comes to projects like KJE. So we'll keep doing that and try to do it better. But the discussions in cabinet, unfortunately, we cannot play all of that discussion and debate in public domain until a decision is made. Now, on local sector capacity, I think one way of going around that, I agree with the gentleman that the oil was a little bit of an unfortunate incident where, one or two major investors in capacities to be able to play a role in the oil sector were disenfranchised. But I think for a business person, it's not about you being guaranteed an opportunity. It's you forecasting and being able to tell where you want to go, when you want to go there. If I recall Dr. Magara starting up with a small outfit somewhere, he had a vision, he had a determination of where he wants to go with the practice. And he strategically positioned that and planned out his investment rollout. And he's still with us today. So I think you have to have that sense of, yes, I'll risk some money. PPPs and any other investments about risk. You take risk, the appetite to take risk. So when you start by saying, oh, I need to be guaranteed a business before I roll out, then you're going to be caught napping, because what is going to happen is the opportunity will come and you're not ready. So I think you need to really set yourself to that. Am I in business and am I going to do it as a commit myself to it? Or am I just trying out and it just, oil is coming there for them, you just also try oil. I think it is something systematic and that must be done. Now, what we are doing to help out, realizing the weaknesses we saw, is to try and get sector players in the private sector to pool resources. So when I tested out with the 50 trucks, I also discovered that you actually have, individual Ugandans with the 5 trucks, 10 trucks here and there. And I'm trying to see, supposing we pool them, because the big developers who come would want to deal with one person. They don't want 50 people lining up to manage 50 trucks. So supposing we pool them, supposing with the banks, with the limitations of our commercial banks, supposing they syndicate, they pool resources. I think our banks cannot play beyond the 25% of their core capital, but supposing they do syndication, can we do that? And increasingly beginning to see some of this happening. Stanbic has actually played a big role in the energy sector, and increasingly they are beginning to lead on infrastructure. And recently they made a decision to now bring in Stanbic holdings in the country, and they are, they're trying to do that. I've seen 1 or 2 other banks who are in advanced stages of planning out to infrastructure lending, which is beginning to come through. So there is an effort, but we also need to do a lot more with the smaller, other non-financial sector, private sector. On Bubu, the effort of government is to standardize, to push standardization. The Ministry of Trade has been working with, I think, the Japanese and other people to see to it that we can get our products to be standardized. For you and me who has bought furniture, just a simple example, for your own household, you know what you've gone through. The gentleman gives you a sample, it's the sample you sign off, then first delivery, the 5 chairs are really tip top, and then the last 20 chairs are completely the opposite of what he delivered. So standardization is important, certification is important, and I think this is an ongoing process which is being done by other stakeholders. May I quickly, if you would allow me, sir, make a small comment on the question that came on related to health, whether
Please
people
go
can
ahead.
actually, whether people
Go
can
ahead.
actually trust the health sector. I really have a major issue here, because I think it's not actually in a patient doesn't know the difference between private and the public until you make it so distinctively different. For those hospitals where private sector involvement is at play and the government exists, they've done what they call a co-location. Now, on our side, we do the complete opposite. Everything is public, 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 because we're not trying to say, what am I going for private? Like Mike has said, you can actually choose to say infrastructure will be government, but when it comes to things like equipment or clinical services, we can bring in the private sector to play a role there. Now, my experience has been with, I tried about 10 years ago when Mike was still the director of the privatization unit, and I talked to Makerere University about getting a co-location. Some good investor wanted to co-locate a hospital near the teaching hospital, Makerere University Teaching Hospital. And all he needed was space, land, and then all the equipment that students needed for learning, advanced equipment that Makerere wouldn't pay or buy through government subvention, would be installed in the co-located tower, and the patients will be wheeled in for purposes of getting the care. The same can be said of Mulago Hospital. My opinion is, yes, we need more Mulago hospitals all over, but we have the existing infrastructure. Supposing we allowed the private sector to co-locate, what that means, you have the existing Mulago hospital infrastructure, and then the private sector builds a tower next to it with a bridge that just connects. And the patients for COVID testing and all these, instead of chasing them away now or for cancer, the moment a doctor, a specialist makes a prescription, or okay, you excuse my language, but the moment he determines that such and such a test is needed, that patient is just wheeled across. All the patient needs is to cross over to get the MRI or whatever it is done on the other side. That is now private sector. They do not have actually to know that that's private sector. So what happens is the medical request is what triggers a payment towards the facility that has been built on this site. It's just so easy, so obvious, and it can be done. So the equipment, the cancer machines, the MRIs, the sophisticated dental equipment that you need all sits here, and it's on lease. What you've done, you've transferred the risk of all of this equipment sitting on your books. You've transferred the risk of replenishment, of replacement of the equipment. Recently we went through this cancer thing, and bear with me, we said when we were buying the new thing is that we actually, the old one was useless. It was no longer the kind of thing that you find on the market. 2 days ago, I saw in the newspaper, the minister or somebody saying, oh, by the way, we've got the latest machine in Africa. Now you can hear the kind of measure we are using. We are the first in Africa. But innovation is happening around the cancer, and the disease is mutating, and therefore we need more technology. The so-called first cancer machine in Africa will, in a few years' time, be the oldest machine, and it will need to be replaced. The moment you do this, where you have this tower built by private sector, you've transferred that risk of replacing every time the need arises to the private sector. And what payment the payment you make comes from the traffic, the patients that come from this side. So it can be done, co-location can happen. And when you do that, therefore government plays one role, regulation, making sure that the standards here are the standards expected in the medical industry, making sure that the tests are certified, they are routinely checked, the audits are happening. So the issue of trust and the cost are addressed if we open up and look on this side. I'll tell you why we don't open up. We don't open up purely because of vested interest in the procurement process. Somebody who is procuring the MRI has an interest. The PPP side is not a procurement because the MRI has been brought in by the private sector. The PPP side is traffic. The patients that are going in there, they trigger a payment because you are buying the service the MRI is giving you. You're not buying the machine, but the service that you get here. So it's so easy. Now what happens is that takes away this man called Jim, who has to now run the procurement process, place tenders, and talk to people and manage that process. They invest the corruption. Maybe let me put it bluntly. It's purely corruption that stops us looking this way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And indeed, the last poll question pointed out corruption as one of our biggest problems on this PPP thing. That brings us to the last poll question for today, before we take another 2 questions, and then we'll bring this to a close. The last poll question for today, and the question reads, what can be done to strengthen the PPP framework in Uganda? What can be done to strengthen the PPP framework in Uganda? The first response is building institutional capacity. The second one is eliminate corruption. The third one is identify sources of more affordable long-term financing options domestically. The fourth one is eliminate bottlenecks in the procurement process. And the last option is all the above. What can be done to strengthen the PPP framework in Uganda? Is it skilling? Is it eliminate corruption? Is it affordable long-term financing? Is it removing bottlenecks in the procurement process, or all the above? What can be done to strengthen the PPP framework in Uganda? In another 30 seconds, we'll be pulling down the polling, and kindly make your opinion and your pitch known on the particular question at hand, that what can be done to strengthen the PPP framework in Uganda? Is it skilling, elimination of corruption, affordable long-term financing, elimination of bottlenecks in the procurement process, or all the above? In the next few seconds, we'll be closing the poll. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And most of us believe we must do everything above: skilling, elimination of corruption, affordable long-term financing, eliminating bottlenecks in the procurement process. And of all the above, skilling and corruption elimination came out at the exactly same level, and 14%, and a very close 11% from affordable financing. Then the bottlenecks took a 6%. So we know how we need to proceed forward based on those polls. We are taking another 2 questions, and then we will bring this discussion to a close today. And I will first read a comment from Connie in Shemerire, and then I will go to the 2 questions. It says, great presentation, Mr. Mugunga, very good insight into the historical perspective. It's also fair to say we are often unable to retain some of our homegrown talent, partly because we fail to empower them. And Connie thinks the comment about calling Bernard a defector was unfair, because Bernard, I guess, was moved by the factors she mentioned above. But no matter, my issue is with the assumption that citizens are required to serve and endure conditions in a situation which does not work for them, simply for the sake of patriotism, as we put it. And she mentions that it's a two-way street. And then she says, with that said, I have to applaud you and the work you do. It's good to get this behind the scenes view. It gives us hope that things are in good hands. And then Herbert Kakiza has 2 questions, but I will go for one. It says, is our institutional, regulatory, and legal framework agile to enable PPP success? And Michael, I think you might be a good one to comment on this. Is our institutional, regulatory, and legal framework agile to enable PPP success? Michael, your comment? Mr. Opaji, could you kindly unmute and respond?
Okay. Yes, thanks. So on the PPP framework, I think the PPP framework in Uganda is agile enough to support. What is useful is the delivery and processes within to support that program. So the PPP unit is already in place, and they are working on a number of programs. I happen to be working with from the IFC side, working with on two projects, the KJE as well as the Kampala, the KCCA solid waste program. Now, looking at the PPP framework, I believe it is robust enough. There are certain areas that cannot be fully, you cannot cover everything, right? So there are certain areas associated with tax and all, and that can be addressed as we go along, right? And these, I think, are already being taken into consideration. I'll just give an example. When we looked at KJE, some of the things like the lack of a national tolling policy had to be addressed outside of the PPP framework. But the PPP framework does give sufficient ground to be able to support the implementation of PPPs without any question. I think it's one of the best laws that are available for implementation of PPP framework, PPPs in sub-Saharan Africa. Could a lot more be done? I think sometimes we shoot ourselves a lot and spend so much time in it trying to address the legal issues and forget that some of this stuff gets refined as you go in the implementation and identify areas that could be improved. The common law allows for such without layering, as in the case of the civil law. So it is possible actually that as time goes on, if there are areas that are identified that could have not been identified earlier on, this can actually be tweaked to make it much better to execute PPPs. But to date, I think it does work well and in the best place to deliver.
Thank you, Michael. I'll just read Apophia's question, but leave it as a comment and then go to the last question for today. Apophia Muhimbura says to Jim, why would you structure a requirement and references meant to the 50 trucks with insured drivers belonging to one company when you very well know that we don't have the capacity? If you really wanted to grow our private sector, would you structure it in such a way to allow them to form a consortium, e.g. any other way that does not eliminate our own? That will take a quick comment, but let me read the last question. And then Joseph Lugema said, for long-term infrastructure projects, land acquisition tends to be a big stumbling block. Have you considered a policy on land ownership in such areas? Would it be prudent to sort out the land issues before such projects are conceived or negotiated? So Jim, those are two questions for you. If we could have them handled within 5 minutes, because we need to bring this to a close. Thank you.
I'll start with the last one from Mr. Lugema. I think what is happening is it's clearly known that government is addressing that. Our land tenure system is the way it is. In places like in the north of the country where public land exists, it's not been as difficult. In the center, it's been quite a challenge. But I know that there are the opportunities that are being created to try and acquire land for infrastructure. I wouldn't want to bring an example, but let me mention, recently we had an experience with, I think there's under the recent hearings for the land fund. You know that part of the money in the land fund is supposed to be used to acquire land for infrastructure. So it can actually happen. The difference with an infrastructure like KJE, it crosses all sorts of land ownership arrangements. So it starts in Kampala, where KCC owns some of the land along the corridor. And then you're into more between Kampala and Mukono, you have into private land. And beyond that, you mean land that is owned by huge estates like the Madivanis and Skol and so on. And therefore, the dynamics are completely different. Some of the land are leases, some are mile land and so on. So you have to deal with them. But yeah, point well taken. We'll definitely continue on engagement to make sure that we resolve that. And also be able to get a fund that can actually resolve these before a project is rolled out. That is the ideal. Unfortunately, the reality is we do not have a bottomless pit of resources to try and acquire all the land we need for all the infrastructure we need to develop. Apophia, why structure a deal like that? Purely because it's a risk. PPPs are not your traditional procurement where risk is not allocated. From the word go, either risk is allocated or is costed. So where you have somebody coming to do a road of that magnitude within timelines and they're deploying private sector money, They need to be sure that the trucks will be available. They need to be sure that these trucks are not going to overturn because the driver is drunk or something that has happened or is unskilled and so on. If you bring them, and remember it's the SPV, they are seated on the contractor side. If that doesn't happen, then he will take either the risk of failing in trucks and their own drivers, or he will cost that risk. And that risk, that cost will be passed on to the project. So it's a way of trying to mitigate that risk so that it doesn't come back on our side. On the issue of the PPP framework, yes, it's robust. The weakness, Mr. Chairman, was over-legislating. I strongly believe all laws are never perfect. There's always somebody thinking out of the box, trying to create a hole in the law so that they go away with it. So my view is simple: test the law, make it apply, and make it work. PPP law enables government to function with the private sector. It does not replace common law. All the other contracts are basically traditional contracting, which has been with us from the days, I think, from long time ago. So there's not a replacement. So the PPP Act just enables that interface and interaction, but the laws are the same. But over-legislating, a contract takes 0 to 5 years, to structure a deal to deliver it to the market. A very good one, depending on the complexity of the deal. Now, if you're going to layer the decision-making process and say, look, let cabinet, actually, Mr. Chairman, what we did, the law was deferred 3 times before it was passed. And the reason was a simple one. Parliament wanted to look at all the documents on any transaction and discuss them and decide upon them. Now, imagine what would have happened if you get Mike and the team to do a transaction for 5 years and then lift the entire volume of books and put them to Parliament, make 400 copies of the same, and get them to decide on whether the project is viable or not. Now, layering decision-making on these projects is a big problem, is a big challenge. So I agree with Mike that let's test out the law, the current framework we have, let's operate within it, and as we go by, we learn. Mr. Chairman, what we've done, where we realize that our legal framework is not sufficient, we adapt international based standards. And there's nothing in the law that stops us from doing that. So we're using both. And where we believe that we can strengthen, we strengthen using international based standards. We have resources at our disposal and we use them. Last one from Connie. Connie, the comment on Bernard was a light moment comment. He is my friend, so it was not badly intended. I made it in the context of Michael Paji, who is in South Africa speaking to us and is Ugandan and worked in these very processes and is working for IFC. Emmanuel Nyirinkini is in Washington. Mr. Orono Tweyo is in Botswana. These are people who are with us. And soon, they leave. And the reason they leave is they get better opportunities, but also we have to empower them. It costs me money to get Mike to speak to us about KJE. The surprising thing is actually, as a unit, as a government, we hire Michael Page to come and arrange and structure KJE for us. So that's the point I was making. So Bernard is one of those now. If I had a transaction and somebody asked me a reference for a local lawyer, I'm potentially going to give Bernard, but he's going to be a cost to me. And yet is a resource that I would have had with me to help out to deliver this. So that was the light moment I talk about.
Jim, you hired IFC, not Michael Pagi, eh?
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, and our discussants and panelists today. Mr. Bernard Owundo, we thank you for the paper presented. Dr. Kenneth Samogero in absentia, thank you for your reactions. Mr. Michael Paji, Mr. Jim Mukunga, thank you so much. And in just a minute each, your last words, in just a minute each. Bernard, starting with you, then we will move on through Michael and then Mr. Mukunga.
Thank you, Paul. And in 10 seconds, I'll just make a comment on the health sector that is very vital. I think one of the things that Jim and his team need to look at is whether if you want to lease a dialysis machine, you need to go through that procedure under the PPP Act. So that's one of the things that has been challenging on the health sector side. I think I did some work for USAID on the health sector and what we can do about the legal regime for PPPs. And that's one of the biggest challenges. Do I have to go through that process of the PPP Act? Can we look at ways of amending that process so that we can be able to facilitate people who just want to lease out dialysis machines and involve private sector and the health sector? That said, thank you very much for hosting us. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dr. Samogere, for the comments. We will take the comments on board and enrich the paper. And thank you to the participants for your questions. It was very enriching. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Michael?
First of all, thank you very much. So Bernard, I think this third piece is a beginning. We should continue to have discussions and try and broaden up the engagement to see how the third piece can be broadened a lot more to be more effective in informing and supporting and guiding government policy decisions. One thing that couple of things I would like to point out. One, PPPs as a solution to address infrastructure now in isolation should actually be avoided as much as possible. Let it be within the broader context of addressing the COVID challenges that government is facing now. Government has fiscal constraints, financial issues have impacted. There are a number of areas that they have to address now. The global impact is it's not known how far this will go, but the clear direction of travel is that it's going to take some time. So what can be done in the interim? So try and package it within that concept, but let the discussion continue. And two, it would be very helpful to continue engagement with the private sector, continue a dialogue with the private sector. I like the fact that Jim is leading the PPP unit. He understands this very well. You know, Jim used to be an investigative reporter in Monitor before we got him to work with the privatization unit. It was very good to bring that aspect into the privatization unit at that point. With that wealth of knowledge, as Jim has been able to articulate, let us, Jim, I think what would be helpful also is to reach out and work more closely with the other stakeholders, especially those who would be reaching out to the private sector and all, and try and manage the existing engagements that are with the private sector. Like I said earlier on, the private sector is always watching. That is very important. The other aspect that I thought I could put is, and this has been in the context of KJE. For KJE, there's a continuous dialogue, there's a continuous reevaluation of risk, there's a continuous development of new mitigation measures. KJE is one of those projects where there is a viability gap fund of more than $500 million provided, of about $500 million being provided by development finance institutions. So the discussion is ongoing with UNRWA and with the PPP unit. I think that dialogue needs to continue. Structuring a bankable project is very, very important, and bringing on board what the impact is to these projects now, especially in this stage, and how this come out and in terms of supporting the process is also something that we need to work out on. The last one is healthy cooperation with the private sector will be more important going forward, not just for the sake of PPPs, but also in looking at exiting the crisis, because like I pointed out, government is going to probably play a significant role in trying to avoid market collapses. That should not be done in isolation. I think they should engage a lot more closely with the private sector during this process. Otherwise, thank you very much, Nekaso, for organizing this. It has been a very candid discussion. Jim is probably the right party and who understands this a lot better. Bernard, it would be very helpful to try and dig a little more, dig deeper in being able to final out and get what needs to be done more constructively from a much wider perspective, looking at the economic response and how PPP fits in it, all right? But also taking into consideration the development budget challenges that are going on and how this fits into the development budget framework development, which is part and parcel of the dialogue that needs to continue. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you so much. Jim, we only have 1 minute for you to make your closing remarks.
Okay, I think I'll pick it from where Mike has left off. there are challenges with the budget process and of course what is available. But what we know is that there's also a scatter, multiplicity of roles. You find a road budgeted for in agriculture because it goes to a farm. You find a road budgeted for by the local government because it's within the principle of the local government geographical area. You find the same road budgeted for by either UNRWA or Ministry of Works. So what we're beginning to do is to mop and look out for what is that duplicity and how can we maximize the use of those resources for infrastructure development. The second one is the realities of the debt, the weight of the debt we carry. Those are beginning to get us, all of us, by the not government only, to look a lot more to how we can fund this infrastructure away from relying on the budget. And one of the things I've been engaging our colleagues in national NDP, the planning, is to try and see whether we can actually assign projects at NDP level. So what happens, we do a national development plan, but those projects are put in the plan and they are just listed. I'm beginning to think, wait a moment, when they are listed, because of the way the responsibilities for accounting for funds are assigned, the accounting officers have mandate to develop plans and spend the money to those plans. I'm beginning to think, supposing we strategically plan our roadmap towards the national development in a way that we commit certain projects to be delivered in a certain cycle, and we allocate those projects to PPP. If we believe that this project can actually be delivered as a PPP, assign and allow it to go through the screening. If you believe this is a direct investment, do it and assign. That way the National Development Plan sort of prescribes a mode of delivery, and that will free the resources. What is happening is that most of us tend to commit resources to do studies, feasibility studies and other studies that are not necessary through certain frameworks, and therefore waste a lot of resources. Lastly, I think COVID for me brings out the requirement for us to explore new ways of doing business. Bernard will agree with me that COVID has sort of pressed a challenge before us. Take the example, the approval processes. If today I tendered out a project, I'm required to make sure that the bidders pick them. That's how the law is written, or the process of delivering the bid. Says pick, physical picking, so that you sign and you get the tender. Evaluation is a team that must sit and meet. And so the legal framework is still back in the days before COVID, that it never foresaw this kind of situation. So we may want to accelerate and deliver these projects so fast, but that challenge still remains. So to be adaptive to the current days is an issue. Decision making, to have a board meeting online and making a decision like we are now seated and making this decision and is binding and therefore can stand the test of time, is itself a challenge that poses a legal issue challenge. So going forward, I think what COVID has done is to wake us up to the reality of how we can do things better. Now, what I've done for me on my side as a unit, I realized that the capacities to do concept notes, to screen projects, to take the project to a point where it can be delivered are not everywhere. So what we've created guidelines, and those guidelines have templates in them. So to bring down the cost of hiring expertise to be able to do that, you can actually visit our website, adapt the templates, look at them, screen your own project from the word go before you even come for the screening exercise, and be able to deliver a project as we speak. So the guidelines are so that they give you a solution on how to deliver a project, on what is expected of you at feasibility study, what are the components of feasibility study, etc. And these guidelines are free to use. So we're beginning to adapt and change, but my invitation is to all of us to play, again, a role in cultivating PPPs, encouraging our partners to come on board and not shy away from PPPs because potentially, given the debt portfolio and the budget constraints, it's the way to go going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And at this point, I would like to hand over to Dr. James Magara to make some closing comments and then make the closing prayer. And that will be our day to day. Thank you very much for all the attendance. Dr. Magara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you very, very much, panelists, for a very educative session. I have learned a lot, and I believe that most of the participants have also learned a lot. There's a lot we don't know, and I do hope that we'll have a lot more education on how things work. It's been a very, very educative engagement. I also would like to just note that one point that has come out strongly, which we've also experienced, this is the 15th webinar we've held since we started, number 15. They're all available on our Facebook page, by the way. You can go back and take a look at all of them. One thing that came up almost in almost every one of them is the lack of engagement between the public and the private sectors. And again, this has come up here. So I do hope that there will be things that will happen that will bridge that divide. And I think COVID has actually made it glaringly obvious, the fact that both sectors need to be in dialogue. And this, I do appreciate the fact that it's come up again today. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Pagi from Johannesburg. Thank you for joining. It was good to see you again on screen after so long. And our special guests, thank you very much, Mr. Jim Mugunga, and in absentia, Dr. Semogere. And Bernard, thank you for leading the thinking and the discussion around this on behalf of CASO. And also, Paul, thank you. So participants, thank you too for spending time this morning. I trust it's been educative, and it's also triggered off other things that we can follow through. I hope in the years to come, we'll have more Ugandan players in that whole arrangement, which at the moment looks a little bit far above our heads. But I do hope we'll have a lot more Ugandans coming on board. So thank you, Paul. And did you want me to close in prayer as well? Paul?
Yes, Tamagara. Yes, sir. Closing prayer.
Okay, let's have a closing word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for the engagement we've had this morning. And we just want to ask that you give wisdom to the PPP unit in the Ministry of Finance, especially as they lead the country in this whole arrangements. And thank you for the insight into the very complex work that they're doing that we often are not completely unaware about. We do pray that you will guide our country as we face very turbulent season, very turbulent season, not only locally, but globally as well. And ask that we'll come out stronger, and we'll get more interaction and more involvement of the private sector in the processes that government is involved in. We pray you bless the rest of our weekend. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. How about you, Paul?
Thank you very much. Until we meet again next Saturday, God bless you all.